If you've ever wondered what medieval farmers used to grow, before potatoes, before supermarkets, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're stepping into their quiet gardens to rediscover 30 forgotten vegetables. Hardy, useful, nourishing plants, now mostly vanished from memory. We'll begin with one, then wander gently through the rest. Before we start, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? If you'd like more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves old things, quietly coming back to life. Now let's begin, beneath the soil, with the first lost treasure. Skirret. In a quiet corner of a long-forgotten medieval garden, tucked beside the stone wall of a crumbling monastery, there once grew a plant you've likely never heard of. Its name was skirret, a word that hums on the tongue like something secret, not quite sharp, not quite sweet. Skirret, a name carried softly through centuries, almost lost in the wind, but not gone. Before the potato reached Europe, before carrots turned orange, before gardens became rows of identical crops, skirret was something special. It wasn't flashy, it didn't climb fences or flower wildly. It lived beneath the surface, quietly, gratefully, generously. Skirret is a root vegetable, long and white, like a slender parsnip, or a pale, delicate finger of sugar. When pulled from the soil, it smells faintly of warmth, of something familiar and kind, and when cooked, it tastes even better. Sweeter than a carrot, softer than a turnip, more comforting than it has any right to be. It was once a staple food, a favorite among both peasants and kings. Yes, kings. Royal gardens grew it on purpose, and not just as a curiosity. Skirret wasn't grown to impress guests, it was grown to be eaten, to nourish, to warm cold bellies through long winters, because that's what it did best. Picture a medieval winter, stone walls, thick with frost, firelight flickering in narrow windows, the garden long gone to sleep beneath a crust of snow, no tomatoes, no cucumbers, no citrus fruit hauled in from across the world, but deep under the frozen ground, skirret waited, patient and ready, its roots hidden in the dark, held fast against the cold. When everything else had failed, when the shelves were bare, skirret could still be pulled from the ground, cleaned, peeled, boiled, roasted, stewed, even baked into sweet, soft pies. And the taste, imagine the comfort of a slow-cooked meal that fills a whole room with memory. That's skirret. Monastic records from the 12th and 13th centuries mention it often. It was grown in tidy rows behind abbey walls. The monks liked it because it was dependable, and because it kept them full during long periods of fasting. Some even believed it had medicinal properties, good for digestion, gentle on the stomach, a food that healed, in the way real food sometimes does. But more than that, skirret asked for so little. It didn't need rich soil, or warm weather, or much water at all. Once planted, it stayed, multiplied quietly, grew deeper, stronger. It was the kind of crop you could trust, not flashy, not quick, but loyal, and perhaps that's why it was forgotten. In the centuries that followed, crops became a business. The world asked for more, bigger roots, faster harvests, longer shelf lives. Skirret, slow, delicate, oddly shaped, didn't fit the new rules, so it disappeared. It wasn't a scandal or a tragedy. No war was fought over skirret. No law was passed to ban it. It simply slipped through the cracks of time, one garden at a time, one generation at a time, until it became a word no one said anymore. But imagine this, a quiet garden in your own backyard, a patch of earth where you plant skirret in spring, and then, you leave it be. Through summer it grows, through autumn it deepens. In winter, when the days are cold and the skies are grey, you walk out with a small spade and dig, and there it is, white, knotted roots, bunched together like secrets. You bring them in, you roast them slowly, with butter and herbs, and as the warmth rises in your kitchen, as the smell of something ancient fills the air, you take a bite of the past, a sweetness that was once known to kings, and to farmers, and to children with muddy hands and winter-chapped cheeks. That's the beauty of skirret. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand to be remembered, but once you've met it, once you've tasted it, it's hard to forget. It was called the comfort of the poor man's table, not in a sorrowful way, but in a way that meant skirret could be trusted, could be counted on, could be grown in the worst of times, and still offer something good. Medieval cooks used every trick they knew to bring out its flavor. They mixed it with honey, with vinegar, with herbs dried on rafters above their kitchen hearths. They mashed it, spiced it, simmered it for hours. They even candied it, turning it into a sweet treat. the kind that might be served at a midsummer festival, or tucked into a satchel for a long walk through the woods. One old recipe, written in Latin, in the curling hand of a 14th century scribe, suggested cooking skirret with milk and nutmeg until it turned to a golden paste. For the warming of the heart, it said, you can almost see the bowl in someone's hands, steaming in the dark of a timber-framed house. You can almost feel the relief of something warm and filling after a day in the snow. And even now, if you search long enough, you can still find the seeds. Skirret isn't gone. Not completely. A few heirloom growers still tend it. A few quiet seed catalogues still offer its strange little name. Some gardeners, curious and patient, have begun growing it again, slowly, carefully, with the same trust the monks once had, and with the same quiet hope that the past might still offer something we've been missing. Because maybe the best food isn't always the newest, or the shiniest, or the quickest to grow. Maybe, sometimes the best food is the one that remembers, that stays, that waits. And maybe, somewhere in your mind, the name skirret will linger, like a buried root, waiting to grow again. Alexander's, out beyond the hedgerows, where the sea breeze touched the soil with salt and the sun broke through cloudy skies in golden stripes. A bold, leafy plant once grew wild and unbothered by fences. Its name was Alexander's. Not a king, though it carried itself like one. Not a weed, though it grew like one. It was a vegetable for the in-between places, between garden and wilderness, between wildness and cultivation, between memory and forgetting. Long before modern parsley filled our kitchens, before celery became the green crunch in every lunchbox, Alexander's was already thriving. It came to Britain with the Romans, perhaps tucked in a pouch on a soldier's belt, or carried in seed form inside a merchant's woven pack, and once it arrived, it liked what it found. Alexander's grew tall, sometimes taller than a man, with glossy dark green leaves that shimmered in the wind. Its flowers were bright yellow, gathered in cheerful clusters, like small suns scattered across its branches. But Alexander's wasn't grown for beauty, it was grown for survival. Every part of the plant could be eaten. The stems, blanched like asparagus. The leaves, added to soups. The roots, dug up and boiled. Even the seeds were used ground into a peppery spice, when true pepper was too expensive or too far away. It was the sort of plant that made itself useful. Medieval cooks liked its strong, slightly musky flavor. Some called it the bridge between celery and parsley, with a deeper, older taste. A taste that clung to the tongue, like the memory of a forgotten song. In the Middle Ages, it was common to find Alexander's growing along monastery walls, beside the sea, or in corners of old fields. It didn't ask to be planted, it simply arrived, flourished, stayed. That independence made it beloved. One chronicler from the 14th century noted that, even in the poorest seasons, Alexander's may be gathered where none was sown, and boiled with lentils to satisfy the hungry. It was a plant for the people, not sold in marketplaces, not counted in tithes. It belonged to whoever found it first. But there was something else about Alexander's, something wilder. Unlike the tidy rows of garden vegetables, Alexander's had a habit of escaping. It grew through cracks in stone walls, it lined the edges of roads, it spread to cliffs and coastal outcrops where no one thought to look for food. It showed up where it wasn't invited, but was always welcome. It was the freelance vegetable, the runaway helper, the good guest who didn't knock, but brought gifts anyway. Some medieval cooks treated it like a delicacy. One old recipe book described a spring dish, young Alexander's shoots simmered in milk, with a dash of vinegar and a handful of chopped hazelnuts. It was served warm, as a tonic for melancholy. In folk medicine, Alexander's was valued for its tonic properties. A tea made from the roots was said to awaken the blood. The leaves were used in poultices for skin ailments. The seeds, when chewed, helped ease sore throats and freshen breath. Yet, for all its usefulness, Alexander's began to disappear. Not because it failed, but because something new arrived. Celery. Celery was more delicate, more uniform, easier to package, to sell, to ship. Over time, it took the place of Alexander's in garden plots, and as gardening became tidier, more precise, more about profit than survival, Alexander's faded, not entirely, not yet. Even now, if you walk along the old coast roads of Britain in springtime, you might still see it, growing where no one asked it to, along a cliff, beside an abbey wall, on the edge of an old Roman road. Its flowers still draw bees, its roots still dig deep into unturned soil, and its leaves still whisper of a time when food didn't come in bags, when vegetables weren't measured in yield per acre, and when a plant could be appreciated for simply showing up, year after year, and offering something good. Imagine gathering a basket of Alexanders on a cool spring morning, the air still misty from dawn. You break off the shoots with your fingers, carry them home in your apron, and as you simmer them in a pot, something ancient fills your kitchen, a scent of salt and earth, of pepper and green, of history wafting upward like steam. That's Alexander's, not forgotten, not completely, just waiting for someone to notice, waiting in the wind. Good King Henry, beneath the worn stone walls of village gardens and monastery cloisters, a hardy little plant once grew, humble in shape, but noble in purpose. Its name still echoes through folk songs and herbal texts. Good King Henry, no one really knows why it was called that. There was no King Henry known for his gardening prowess, no decree from the throne giving this leafy green its name. But perhaps, in the quiet way that peasants often named their plants, it was given the title out of affection, because this was a plant that never failed them. Good King Henry was dependable. You could plant it once and forget it. It would return the next spring, and the one after that, as faithful as the sun. Its roots pushed deep into the earth, its stems sturdy and its leaves broad and dark, a welcome sight in the thin green days of early spring. When winter was harsh and food was low, when root cellars had been picked clean and the stores of grain were thin, good King Henry was often the first fresh green to push through the thawing soil, and with it came the promise of nourishment. It was called the poor man's asparagus, but that doesn't quite capture it. The young shoots, when harvested early, could be steamed and eaten just like the luxury stalks of spring. The leaves, once matured, were rich and iron-heavy, more so than spinach, and a rare source of vitamin C when it mattered most. Even the flower buds, small and green like tiny knobs of broccoli, were cooked and savored. One plant, 3 uses, no wonder it was known in some places simply as all good. In old herbal texts it was praised for its healing properties as well. The leaves could be poulticed onto wounds, the roots brewed into tea to ease digestion. In the lowlands of the north, some called it wild spinach and counted it among the first blessings of spring. But good King Henry never grew proud. It liked to stay near homes, near people. It often nestled close to walls, behind cottages, or under the eaves of barns. It didn't mind the shade. It didn't mind neglect. It simply grew. There are stories of grandmothers who would mark the patch each year with a smooth stone, teaching the next generation to gather only the first tender shoots. And when boiled and buttered, those shoots tasted of both earth and hope. They carried the faint bitterness of winter still lingering in the soil, but softened by something richer, something that made your tongue remember the warmth of summer. Monks grew it too. In the gardens of abbeys and priories, good King Henry was a quiet staple, not glamorous, not traded, but known, cared for, respected. And as the centuries passed, it remained a friend to the kitchen, until it wasn't. What changed? It wasn't that good King Henry stopped growing, it was that our gardens stopped needing it. As farming became about yield, uniformity, and appearance, the plant's odd shapes and unpredictable growing habits made it less desirable. And when spinach was bred to grow faster and look smoother, the humble perennial faded into the background. But it never truly vanished. You can still find it if you look, growing in the forgotten corners of old homesteads, behind stone cottages that haven't been lived in for decades, near the backsteps of ancient gardens where someone once planted it and then moved on. The plant waits, year after year, and in that patience is its magic. Imagine stepping out on a grey April morning. The mist still clings to the grass, the chill hasn't yet left the air, but there near the base of the wall you see it. Good King Henry, already awake, already growing. You kneel, you gather, you remember. In your hands you hold something more than just a green stem. You hold a connection to those who came before, to a time when the land fed us not with abundance, but with generosity, when every leaf counted, when the first green of spring was not decoration, but a blessing. That's what good King Henry meant, and perhaps it still does. Not a plant for the market, not a crop for the ledger, but a friend to the garden and a quiet king of the kitchen, waiting still in the forgotten corners of the land. Sea kale, the salt-kissed survivor. In the hush of a salt wind and the long breath of the tide, there grows a plant that once fed the forgotten edges of medieval Europe. Tonight, we walk not through tilled fields or forested glades, but along the pale shingle shores where few crops dared grow, and yet one quietly did. Its name is sea kale. Not a vegetable of polished gardens or noble estates, but one shaped by brine and stone. It was here, along the coastlines and river mouths, that medieval gatherers spotted it, broad, ruffled leaves rising from the pebbles like an emerald flag in the wind. Neither fragile nor fussy, this wild plant had already learned how to thrive, where most plants simply withered. And for those who noticed, sea kale offered something rare, a food that asked for nothing but recognition. We step now along one of those old coasts, somewhere in the southern shires, where the sea still smooths the stones and seabirds drift in silence above the waves. The tide is low, and tucked between driftwood and dune, thick-leafed sea kale catches the morning light. It smells faintly of salt and green sap, and though no garden wall surrounds it, this is still cultivation, in its most ancient form, gathering, rather than growing. In early spring, medieval families would walk out to the shores with baskets in hand. The young shoots of sea kale, pale and tightly furled, were prized tender and sweet, like asparagus touched by the sea. They could be steamed, boiled, or braised in clay pots with herbs and milk, a delicacy of the coast when inland fields still lay bare. By summer, the plant would stretch outward, leaves wide and rippling, catching every bit of sunlight and sea spray. Its roots delved deep, anchoring it through storms. Its blossoms, creamy white and fragrant, would draw in bees and passers-by alike. But what few knew was that beneath the pebble bed and wind-blown foliage lay another treasure, roots thick and knotted, storing strength through the winter. Sea kale was more than food. It was a lesson in endurance. In hard years, when crops failed inland and trade routes were uncertain, the shorelines remained, and so did the sea kale. Monks from coastal abbeys wrote of it, noting its usefulness, its resilience, and its curious ability to regrow again and again in the same stony patch. In some places, families began cultivating it deliberately, covering the shoots with clay pots to blanch them, making them even more tender. This quiet knowledge passed from generation to generation, spoken softly over stew pots and among seaside hedgerows. Imagine a family huddled in a stone cottage near the edge of the sea. The wind hisses through the cracks, and smoke curls from the chimney. Inside, a mother peels onions beside a bubbling pot, while her son returns with a bundle of sea kale shoots tucked into the fold of his cloak. Outside, the sheep press close to a dry stone wall, and above them, gulls wheel and cry. There are no greenhouses here, no warm beds or market stalls, but there is food, there is sea kale. Its taste, like asparagus, yes, but also something else, something wilder. A flavor touched by the sea and wind and stone, tender, earthy, slightly bitter, with a trace of brine, as if it remembers the tides it grew beside. And the roots dug in autumn were like buried treasure, roasted slowly in embers or sliced into stews. They offered sustenance when the days grew dark and the fields stood empty. Even in February, beneath a foot of snow or frost-glazed stones, a practiced hand could find them. It was knowledge passed not by books, but by fingers and memory. As agriculture became more structured and moved inland, sea kale began to vanish from the plates of the people. The invention of industrial tools and the shift toward high-yield monoculture meant less space for plants that preferred to grow outside the lines, plants that didn't take kindly to factory farming, and so it quietly receded, but not entirely. Somewhere in the old counties, along forgotten beaches and uncut cliffs, it still grows. If you've ever walked along the English coast in late spring and seen a lush, waxy green bush flowering with star-shaped white petals, you may have walked past one of the last medieval vegetables, still living wild. In the 19th century, a few Victorian gardeners tried to bring it back. They planted sea kale in walled gardens, built blanching pots to tame its flavor, even served it in banquets with hollandaise and cream. For a time it returned, but fashions change, and by the 20th century the taste for wildness had faded. Still, sea kale endures. It grows where it pleases, on cliffs, dunes, gravelly shorelines, a stubborn survivor, a whisper of the past, and perhaps one day it will return again, not as a novelty, but as a reminder that food does not have to be easy to harvest to be worth eating, that a plant shaped by salt and wind can be just as nourishing as one bred for beauty, that the edges of the world hold wisdom worth remembering. So we leave the shore now, the sea behind us, and the scent of salt fading. Our path leads on, through another forgotten gate, into the next garden. There are still so many plants to discover, still so many flavors sleeping in the soil. The garden isn't gone, it's only sleeping, waiting for us to remember. Chickweed, the tiny green generous guest. If you walk the old hedgerows or garden paths of Europe, you might brush against it without noticing. Chickweed. So small, so ordinary. A lace of green spreading low and quiet across the soil, like a living whisper, but don't let its modest look fool you. Chickweed was one of the most beloved and persistent plants in all of medieval Europe. Chickweed didn't wait for gardeners, it didn't need to be coaxed or carefully tended. No ceremonial planting, no special soil, no desperate prayers for rain. It simply appeared as if summoned by the turning of the seasons itself. It slipped between fence posts, along cottage edges, beneath the hooves of oxen, and even into the corners of cloistered monastery gardens. In the medieval world, chickweed was simply there, an ever-present companion to those who worked the land. Its soft green leaves, shaped like tiny teardrops, hugged the ground with humility. A single thread of white traced each leaf's center, barely visible, unless you paused to really look. And when it flowered, chickweed offered up little white stars, 5 petals split so deeply they appeared as 10, like delicate snowflakes scattered across the earth. Peasants, monks, midwives and cooks knew it well. They didn't need books to teach them its name or its worth. For centuries, chickweed was simply known, and more than that, it was gathered. Because while nobles feasted on roasts and honeyed fruits, chickweed fed those who had little. During long winters, when root cellars emptied and green vegetables vanished from sight, chickweed remained. If the ground wasn't frozen, it grew. Quietly, freely, endlessly. A basketful gathered at dawn could become a midday salad, or be chopped into pottage with oats and broth. The leaves, tender and mild, had a taste that echoed spring itself, light, clean, alive. But chickweed was never just food. Midwives steeped its leaves in warm water to make compresses. The gentle poultices cooled rashes, soothed burns, and comforted aching joints. It was a healer in the hedgerows. Chickweed tea, steeped slowly by the fire, eased coughs and fevers. Its cooling nature was spoken of in old herbals and whispered about in kitchen gardens. It was also a sign of the health of the land. Farmers welcomed its presence. Chickweed signaled soil that was rich, living, and moist. It crept into garden beds not as a rival, but as a reminder that nature was still working, even when the farmer rested. Of course, not everyone loved it. As modern farming marched in with straight lines and tidy rows, chickweed's unruly presence became inconvenient. The age of plows and pesticides didn't have patience for wild generosity. Chickweed was labeled a weed, something to be removed, controlled, forgotten. But those older voices, the ones who walked the land with boots caked in loam and eyes always watching the horizon, they would have said otherwise. In the cold months when green was gone, chickweed was green. When fresh flavor was rare, it gave its softness. When wounds needed tending, and babies needed comfort, it stepped forward, never flashy, never loud, just there, like a friend who doesn't need to be asked. And in that way, chickweed holds something few plants do, a spirit of quiet generosity, of uninvited help that comes when you need it most. It didn't just grow for people, it stayed with them. You can still find it now, if you know where to look. It creeps beneath fences, grows up through city cracks, whispers along the edges of forgotten gardens, still working, still offering, still being chickweed. And maybe that's enough. So tonight we thank the small things, the plants that never asked for praise, that fed the hungry, healed the wounded, painted the ground in green, even in the cold. Chickweed's story isn't one of glory, it's a story of quiet presence, and sometimes that's the most important kind. Now rest here a while, as the stars of chickweed bloom quietly across the earth. The wind is soft, the garden is still, and the tiniest leaves carry the oldest comfort. Fat hen, the uninvited feast. In the quiet corners of old fields where stone walls crumble and forgotten paths vanish into meadow, something green still grows. You might pass it without a glance. It doesn't wave for attention, doesn't wear bright colors or grand petals, and yet it once filled the bellies of kings and peasants alike. Fat hen they called it, a name that seems silly, even careless. But make no mistake, this was a plant of deep purpose. Fat hen was not invited into gardens. It showed up on its own. Like chickweed, it volunteered. It grew beside barley fields, in garden borders, in the nooks of monastery walls. It wasn't planted, it appeared, as if it already belonged, as if it remembered its place before humans did. The plant itself is simple, upright, bushy, green with a hint of grey, like the underside of a bird's feather. Its leaves, shaped a bit like the prints of little hands, carried a faint powdery dust, and when summer deepened, it scattered tiny flowers, almost hidden, like the murmurs of a story barely told. But those who knew the land knew fat hen. In Latin, they called it Chenopodium album, white goosefoot, but medieval farmers called it dinner, because when times were lean, when crops failed, or wars marched through villages, fat hen remained. Imagine the land in late spring, when grain had yet to grow tall, the days lengthened, the nights softened, but the food stores dwindled. In that hungry gap between old harvests and new hopes, it was fat hen that filled the pot. Its leaves, tender when young, could be cooked, like spinach, rich in iron, calcium, and protein. Its seeds, so small and many, could be ground into flour, or stirred into gruel. In some parts of Europe, it was kept on purpose, right along the edge of the main garden, like a spare loaf of bread. Even the monks, careful chroniclers of daily life, took note. In the marginalia of a 13th century French herbal, there's a small smiling figure, tending to a bushy fat hen plant. Next to it, in neat brown ink, "Use for lentils, when there are none." Fat hen was lentil, and bean and green all in one, and it didn't just feed the poor. Records from great houses show that fat hen was served in kitchens of the wealthy, especially during fasting seasons. You see, it wasn't about status, it was about what worked, and fat hen worked. But that wasn't all. The plant had uses beyond the pot. Herbalists gathered it to ease inflammation, to calm irritated skin. In some places, it was dried and stored for winter teas. In others, it was simply trusted as a helper, the kind you don't think about until you need them. Villagers might not have known the chemistry, but they knew the effect. Children with rashes were washed with steeped leaves, elders with sore joints drank the brew, and in the back of the mind, there was always comfort in knowing that if all else failed, fat hen was there, and it had cousins. Lots of them. Quinoa, in fact, is a cousin of fat hen, still grown and cherished high in the Andes. But while quinoa traveled the world, fat hen stayed local, and quietly, as the centuries passed, it slipped away. Modern farming had no room for it. Weeds, they called it. Something to spray, to rip out, to forget. And so it was, slowly, one field at a time. Weeds. The word changed everything. Once a food, then a nuisance, then a stranger. We taught ourselves to fear what we didn't control, yet in forgotten places, it still rises. If you go walking through the footpaths of Wales, or the hills of northern France, or even the overgrown edges of a country garden, you may find it, still growing, still offering, still being fat hen. It grows in disturbed soil. That is its secret. It thrives where the earth has been turned, where footprints have passed. It is a plant of recovery. There is a kind of resilience in plants like this, a softness that hides a stubborn will. No one waters it, no one tends it, and yet it thrives. In the time before supermarkets, before rows of perfect lettuces wrapped in plastic, there was the land, and the land gave what it could. Fat hen was a part of that quiet gift, a plant that said, "If nothing else, I am here." It became part of local sayings. In Devonshire, they said, "As sure as fat hen on Midsummer's Eve." In parts of Ireland, it was known as mealweed, because it could stretch a family's grain supply. Children learned to gather it, elderly hands knew how to wash it, new brides added it to stews on cold spring nights. And now, perhaps it is time to learn again. Imagine it, a garden not of control, but of invitation, a plot of earth where wild greens are not weeded, but welcomed, where fat hen grows at the edge of every bed, not to be conquered, but to be understood. So tonight we remember not just the crops we once chose, but those we never really did, the ones that grew anyway, the ones that stayed, and still stay, even when they're forgotten. Fat hen fed Europe, in times of war and peace, feast and famine, not because it was glamorous, but because it never left. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we found it again. Let your mind wander now, to the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, a green breeze through tall grass. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden gate creaks, the sun lowers behind a line of distant trees, and there, at your feet, a plant waits, familiar, forgotten, generous. Fat hen, its story was never loud, but it never stopped being true, and in that quiet truth, there is nourishment still to be found. Let it feed your thoughts, let it rest beside you, like the memory of a good meal. In silence, it grows. The wandering root, parsnips' forgotten cousin, Hamburg-rooted parsley. Long before modern agriculture trimmed the vegetable kingdom down to a predictable handful of supermarket staples, the medieval world was brimming with odd, wondrous crops that danced between culinary innovation and botanical resilience. One of the quiet stars of that forgotten harvest was a peculiar root that once held a cherished place in gardens and kitchens across Europe. Hamburg-rooted parsley, not quite a parsnip, not quite a carrot, and certainly not just parsley as we know it today. This plant, part herb, part root, entirely underappreciated, was a cornerstone of nourishment in many medieval households, and yet somehow, it slipped away from our plates as the centuries turned. Let's walk slowly now, through crooked rows of old earth, and into a time when this plant was still known by name and flavor. In the soft hush of a medieval kitchen garden, where the wind rustled gently through rows of leeks, cabbages, and broad beans, one patch stood apart, not because of its brilliance, but because of its subtlety. The green fronds of Hamburg-rooted parsley swayed like modest feathers above the dark soil, barely noticed except by those who knew to seek it. To the casual eye, it looked like common parsley, perhaps a bit fuller, a bit more rugged, but beneath the surface, the soil held its treasure, a pale, tapering root that resembled the parsnip, though earthier and denser in flesh. In medieval herbals, Hamburg-rooted parsley was prized for its dual nature. The tops could be clipped for their fresh, peppery green flavor, added to broths and porridges, but the real reward came after the harvest, when the roots were gently dug, washed of their clinging earth, and brought to the fire, boiled, roasted, or stewed with grains. This root offered a nutty, rich warmth that reminded many of turnips but with a wilder, deeper edge. It was not a flashy vegetable, not one to grace feasts or royal banquets. Instead, it lived in the margins, modest kitchens, monastic cloisters, and the clay pots of wandering herbalists. The root was slow growing, taking nearly a full season to reach its prime. But those who waited were rewarded with a crop that could be stored through the long winter months, feeding families when other greens had long disappeared. That patience made Hamburg-rooted parsley a quiet hero of the medieval table. In monastery records from the 12th century, there are notes about its use in healing broths, meant to soothe the gut and warm the bones during Lenten fasts. The roots, sliced thin and dried near the hearth, were often kept in bundles hung from the rafters. There, beside onions and wild garlic, they waited to be rehydrated and stirred into steaming pots on cold days. Traveling apothecaries carried dried pieces of Hamburg parsley root in their bundles, using them to brew strong teas meant to fortify the weary and cleanse the blood. In some folk traditions, the root was even considered protective, tied with red string and hung over doorways to guard against illness in the darker months. Its aroma when roasting was familiar, comforting, a scent somewhere between roasted chestnuts and herb-laced broth. Peasants, especially in colder regions, came to rely on it not just for nutrition but for morale. There is something about the scent of roasting roots in a clay oven that brings the mind to rest. And in medieval towns, where meat was rare and butter a luxury, a thick stew of grains, dried beans and Hamburg parsley root might be the finest meal a person saw all week. In some regions, this plant had many names, turnip-rooted parsley, Dutch parsley, and white-root parsley among them. Each name hinted at the plant's shifting identity, its habit of being both known and unknown, cherished yet overlooked. But like so many useful things, it eventually began to fade. With the arrival of the New World crops, particularly the fast-growing, high-yielding potato, roots like Hamburg parsley were edged out of garden beds. Their long-growing season, modest size, and humble reputation made them less attractive in the commercial age. By the 1800s, few households still grew it. Seed merchants dropped it from their lists. The herbalists who once praised its mild detoxifying effects began to forget it. Even in monasteries, where old traditions held firm, it slowly disappeared from the ledgers. Yet the plant never fully vanished. In a few quiet corners of Central Europe, particularly in Germany and the Czech lands, Hamburg-rooted parsley survived in folk gardens. Grandmothers passed down the seed in envelopes, lined with wax paper. They remembered the root's flavor in soups and its role in reviving tired bodies after illness. In old recipe books written by hand and passed through generations, the instructions remain: add parsley root, sliced thin with barley, simmer long. And now, perhaps it's time for it to return, not just to the field, but to the memory, to the taste buds, to the quiet gardens of those who still believe in slow food and long seasons. Imagine it, a soft, misty morning. You walk barefoot into your little patch of earth, the dew clinging to your ankles. You part the leaves, touch the topsoil, and gently lift a root from the ground. You take it inside, scrub it clean with a bristle brush, and set it on the cutting board. Later, as the soup simmers and the room fills with warmth, you taste something ancient and good. That is the gift of Hamburg-rooted parsley. It asks very little, just patience, a bit of soil, and a quiet place in your garden. And in return, it gives you sustenance, healing, and a whisper of the old world, where vegetables were not just food but companions through the seasons. Rampion. The bellflower beneath the moon. Long before bedtime snacks came wrapped in plastic or stacked neatly on supermarket shelves, before fast food or refrigeration, evening hunger meant one thing in medieval households: a slow walk into the garden, under stars or candlelight, to fetch something that could calm both belly and spirit, and few plants were as quietly important to this nighttime ritual as rampion, a name that may sound like a character from a storybook, but was once a real and beloved root known across Europe. Rampion, also called rampion bellflower, is a delicate yet resilient plant with sky-blue flowers and slender taproots that once filled cottage gardens from France to the forests of England. It belonged to a group of vegetables that blurred the line between food and folk remedy, between wild beauty and reliable nourishment, and while today most people know it, if at all, as a passing reference in fairy tales like Rapunzel, the truth is, rampion was real, edible, and important. Our story begins with its appearance. Rampion grows low and wide, its leaves forming a quiet green rosette close to the soil. From this base rise tall stems topped with bell-like blossoms, the kind of flower that bees seem to hum around just a little longer than others. Its roots, though, were what truly mattered to hungry households. Thin, white, and gently tapering, they resembled a more fragile carrot, but brought with them a subtle nutty sweetness and soft, satisfying crunch. In a world without dessert, rampion roots offered a gentle pleasure. What made rampion unique wasn't just its flavor or appearance, it was its balance. You could eat nearly every part of the plant. The leaves were harvested when young, offering a mild taste not unlike spinach, but with a softer, springier texture. These greens often appeared in morning porridges, or stirred into warm bowls of broth. But the roots were where its true value lay. Dug up slowly by hand with wooden tools or bare fingers, they required patience, but repaid the effort many times over. Rampion's roots didn't grow quickly. A full harvest could take 2 seasons, but this meant the roots developed their flavor gradually, absorbing the minerals of their place. The slaty hills of the north, the sandy soils near riverbanks, the loam-rich gardens of monasteries. It was a root of memory, each one shaped by the land it grew in. In some households, especially in the Alps and the high country of what is now Germany, families marked the rows where rampion had been planted years before, waiting with anticipation for the right moment to unearth them. There's a quiet intimacy in that act, digging into the earth not for something flashy or immediate, but for something known, something expected, something earned. That's what rampion offered, a rooted promise. Medieval households didn't just rely on rampion for food. Like many of the plants in their garden, rampion had a foot in the world of medicine too. Folk healers believed that its roots could cool inflammation and aid digestion. Others boiled the leaves into teas for restlessness or nervous ailments. And in certain corners of Europe, rampion was associated with the moon, its pale flowers opening under twilight skies, its roots harvested best by moonlight, according to some. A bedtime root in more ways than one. In one tale passed down near the Black Forest, a grandmother teaches her granddaughter how to recognize rampion from similar plants. It wears the sky on its face, she says, referring to its blue blossoms, but hides the sweetness in its feet. Generations learned this way, by feel, by scent, by watching when the bees lingered longest. By the 1400s, rampion had become a staple in many monastic gardens. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized self-sufficiency, and rampion's ability to serve as both food and remedy made it ideal. The monks would roast its roots beside parsnips or mash them into a simple meal with butter and herbs. On fasting days, rampion replaced meat with ease, satisfying, filling, and modest. It wasn't just monks who valued it. In peasant homes, rampion featured in evening stews and pottage. It was a garden snack for children, freshly rinsed and chewed raw while chores were finished before nightfall. In some regions, it was even offered to guests as a gesture of comfort, a bowl of warm broth with rampion root slices curled within, like white petals drifting in dusk. But with the Renaissance came new seeds and new appetites. Trade routes brought strange foreign vegetables from warmer places. The humble rampion, with its slow-growing ways, began to vanish. Larger root crops like the turnip or the fast-growing carrot began to take its place in fields and kitchens. By the 1700s, rampion had retreated from cultivation entirely, surviving only in pockets of wilderness and in the margins of fairy tales. Yet in those stories, it held on. In one version of the Rapunzel tale, it is rampion, not some exotic herb, that the pregnant mother craves. She sees it growing in a forbidden garden, and longs for its taste so strongly that it becomes the reason her child is taken away. This tells us something curious. Rampion was important enough to be remembered, even in fantasy. A craving strong enough to change a life. Today the plant still exists. It grows wild in parts of Europe, along hedgerows, in forgotten churchyards, sometimes even in modern gardens, where it's been mislabeled as a decorative bellflower. But few people harvest it. Fewer still know its roots are edible, but perhaps it's time to remember. Time to listen again to the bees that linger near its flowers. To run fingers through the soil, slow and searching, to find the sweetness hidden at the feet of a flower. Rampion is the kind of plant you don't rush, and maybe that's what makes it so needed in our time. A rooted reminder that some treasures grow slowly, quietly, beneath the moon. And so, our journey continues, one root at a time. The parsnip's wild ancestor. Somewhere in the cold curl of a forgotten valley, under a shroud of mist and pale sunlight, a crooked garden leans against the edge of an old stone wall. This is not a place of colour or polish. There are no rows, no fences, no tidy order, just soil, ancient, dark and whispering, and low brush that bends with the season's breath. And here, buried just beneath the frost-bitten ground, grows something few today would recognize. It is long and pale, slender and gnarled. It smells of cold roots and clay. This is not the parsnip you've seen in grocery aisles, clean and plump, stacked in rows under artificial lights. No, this is its wild cousin, the ancestor, the forager's treasure, the peasant's winter lifeline, not as historians or gardeners, but as quiet visitors from another time, one where the most important things were the ones pulled straight from the ground, because before potatoes arrived from the New World, before carrots were orange, and before shelf lives were measured in barcodes, there was this root, humble, pale, and essential. And its story is not just one of food. It is a story of patience, of cold seasons endured, of knowing the land and listening to its rhythms. So we begin, not in a kitchen, but in a field, a medieval field in the middle of nowhere. The air is still, the earth is sleeping, but under its surface, something waits. The wild parsnip's ancestor isn't impressive at first glance. Its root is thinner, often forked, its flesh a little woodier than the modern kind. But what it lacks in elegance, it more than makes up for in spirit. It was, in every sense, a survival plant. In the early months of the year, February, March, even into April, when last year's stores had run low and new crops hadn't yet arrived, medieval families turned to what still lived beneath the earth, and the wild parsnip, left in the soil through winter, had grown sweeter with the cold. That's one of the root's secret gifts. Cold converts its starches into sugars. Every icy night becomes a kind of quiet alchemy, transforming toughness into tenderness. It wasn't just a backup plan, it was the main course. And unlike many cultivated plants of today, the wild ancestor needed almost no help to thrive. It seeded itself, grew through weeds, and returned each year with little encouragement. It didn't need fertilizers. It didn't require careful rows. It needed only space, time, and a patch of willing earth. You can imagine the peasant bending low to pull one from the ground, hands numb, breath a ghost in the morning air. The root comes free with a soft sound, damp and pale. It smells of life held in cold sleep, a promise, coaxed from the soil. In the medieval kitchen, a smoky space of low beams and earthen floors, that root would be scraped clean with a dull knife, then added to the day's pot, perhaps boiled with leeks and barley, perhaps roasted over coals, maybe mashed with herbs from the hedgerow. It fed not just the stomach, but the spirit, because it was dependable, because it reminded people that even in the dead of winter, something was still willing to grow. The root's usefulness didn't stop with food. In old herbal texts, wild parsnip was recommended as a tonic for digestion, for coughs, for those feeling cold inside and out. Its leaves were sometimes applied to the skin to soothe sores, its seeds used to flavor drinks or ease discomfort. It was never flashy, never fashionable, but it was known. There's something beautiful in that kind of quiet reputation, something calming. Not all heroes wear crowns, some just grow where they're planted, and come back year after year. And yet, over time, the wild parsnip story faded. As agriculture shifted, as traders brought new foods from abroad, and as the idea of progress crept into the garden, old varieties were pushed aside. New cultivars, bred for size and sweetness and shelf appeal, replaced them. The ancient root was left in the margins, sometimes growing wild along roadsides, sometimes mistaken for weeds, almost always ignored. but even now, in forgotten corners, you might still find it. Look in the hedgerows, on untended slopes, near old stone foundation. That pale root may still be there, quietly waiting, just as it always has, and if you dig it up, clean it off, and take the time to cook it slowly, low and gentle, with patience and warmth, it will reward you. The flavor is soft, earthy, slightly sweet, familiar, but deeper, like a memory you didn't know you had. A reminder that food, at its best, isn't just something to fill us, it's something to root us, to connect us with those who came before, who bent to the same soil, dug up the same roots, and carried them home through the cold. In this way, the wild ancestor of the parsnip still speaks, in silence, in seasons, in the simple act of growing. So next time you walk through a quiet field, or pass by a wild patch of roadside growth, wonder what's hidden beneath. Wonder what was once eaten, once planted, once treasured, long before supermarkets or cookbooks. The past may be buried, but some parts still breathe, and the parsnip's wild ancestor is still listening. Beneath the black root, the secret life of Scorzonara. Not all roots shine brightly, not all treasures gleam. Some, you see, are dark by design, hidden in plain soil, overlooked by eye and name alike. They do not beg attention, they do not dress themselves in color. They simply wait, like ink beneath parchment, like depth beneath still water. Tonight, we uncover one of these quiet companions. Its name is Scorzonara, a strange name, perhaps, unfamiliar to most, hard to pronounce, easy to forget, but once, long ago, it was beloved in cloisters and kitchens alike, grown for its taste, respected for its healing, and harvested each autumn by hands that knew what value looked like, even in black. So let's walk together now, along the low garden walls of a medieval priory, beside the narrow beds of an old manor, and into the quiet shadow of a vegetable nearly lost to time. Scorzonara, a name thought to come from the Italian scorzonara, meaning black bark, and that is what it looks like. At first glance, a long narrow root, dark brown to black, with rough skin like bark. It isn't pretty, but peel it, and you'll find ivory within. Not so unlike people, perhaps rough without, gentle within. This plant is kin to the dandelion and the sunflower, though you wouldn't guess it by the look. It sends up slender green leaves, sometimes a small yellow flower that mimics the sun, but its real work lies hidden in the earth, where its root stretches deep and straight, often longer than a man's forearm. And it was this root that medieval folk sought, not for color, not for decoration, but for nourishment that lingered when other things failed. In the cooler months of the medieval year, after harvest was over and frost began to lace the hedgerows, the people turned to their roots. Not metaphorically, but literally, down to the dark earth they went, spades in hand, digging slowly, carefully, and from the soil, black as ink, they pulled Scorzonara. It was known in kitchen gardens from the Alps to the Low Countries. In Italy and France, in Germany and Poland, it traveled quietly, in seed pouches and memory, from one monastery to the next. It was not as common as leek or cabbage, nor as loud as garlic or onion, but it had a place. In times of hunger, it gave food, in times of illness, it offered medicine, and in times of plenty, it was roasted in butter and herbs, boiled in broths, mashed into pottages, or baked into pies for the wealthier tables, a root for all seasons and all people. Let's pause for a moment and picture the kitchen where it was prepared. A low-beamed room, dark but warm. Firelight flickers in a stone hearth. Hanging on hooks above the chimney are strings of herbs, bay and thyme, some rosemary perhaps. On a wooden table lies a small pile of roots, parsnip, burdock, and one long black Scorzonara. The cook wipes her hands on a cloth, then takes a paring knife and scrapes back the skin. Ivory, smooth, fragrant. It's dropped into boiling water with a pinch of salt. The smell is mild and nutty, like artichoke, like something just barely sweet. It will become tonight's soup, alongside leeks and a bit of barley, and if fortune favors, a splash of goat's milk to thicken it. For the noble household, Scorzonara might be served in cream, or with truffle, if you were very lucky. But for most it was its softness that mattered, its comfort. It filled a stomach, it warmed the cold. Healers saw something more. In the old herbals, Scorzonara appears not just as food, but as cure, a tonic for fevers, a remedy for bites, a draught against poison. Some even called it viper's herb, believing it to counteract the venom of snakes. Perhaps the dark skin lent it that air of mystery, or maybe it truly did help. We may never know for sure, but the trust was there, passed hand to hand, garden to garden, recipe to remedy. Even the monks, careful recorders of medicinal knowledge, grew it within their walls, for digestion, for strength, to settle the stomach, to ease the troubled breath. It was never flashy, but it was known. Time, however, favors the loud, the beautiful, the easy, and so Scorzonara faded. By the 17th century, it was overtaken by salsify, its white-skinned cousin, easier to prepare, easier to pronounce. Soon Scorzonara was grown mostly in Eastern Europe, and even there, only in pockets. Its name became a tongue twister, its flavor a memory. The gardens forgot, but the soil remembers. There are still seeds to be found, still a few old kitchen plots in Belgium or Slovakia, where it grows tall and green each spring, its dark roots deep and waiting for someone curious, someone quiet, someone like you. Scorzonara doesn't shout for attention, but if you plant it, it will grow. It will stretch slowly downward, patient through drought, patient through chill, and when the others are done, when summer crops fade, and the pantry thins, it will be there, under your feet, soft inside, ready. And if you dig it, and clean it, and taste it warm from the pot, you may find something not only delicious, but grounding, something that connects you to the long string of hands before you, who planted, harvested, and healed with the same small root. Let us linger here, just a while longer, in the garden at dusk, in the silence between seasons, in the company of a forgotten plant that once fed the poor, soothed the sick, and waited through the snow. This is Scorzonara's story, the black root, the quiet healer, the lost guest of winter feasts, and still, if we let it, a part of the soil's wisdom. Marsh windwort. Long ago in the soft folds of the medieval countryside, where pastures soaked in morning mist and low riverbanks whispered stories no man could remember, there grew a curious little plant with violet flowers and a name that sounded like an old injury. Marsh windwort. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, does it? And yet this odd-sounding herb quietly earned a reputation among medieval folk as one of the most dependable healers in all the green world. Its name wasn't a metaphor. The plant was, quite literally, for wounds, deep ones, cuts, scrapes and gashes from axe or plowshare, the kind of injuries that came from a hard day's labor, or from skirmishes on the edge of lawless woods. The kind of pain that lingered. Marsh windwort stood among the hedgerows and wet ditches and said, quietly, I can help. It never asked for attention. It was neither flashy nor fragrant. It didn't bloom in bold sunshine or decorate noble gardens. It preferred the shadows of the marsh, the edges of where dry land gave way to mystery. Medieval herbalists believed it to be one of nature's secret protectors, quiet, reliable, and always nearby, if you knew where to look. The leaves of marsh windwort, when crushed and steeped into a poultice, drew out infection. Applied raw, they slowed bleeding. Even the roots, gnarled and stubborn beneath the mud, were used in healing salves. In a world without bandages, antibiotics, or anesthetics, this plant was something close to a miracle. Villagers passed down its uses through stories, not books. A grandmother showing a child how to wrap a wounded knee. A village healer muttering prayers while preparing a wash from its leaves. Even monks in cloistered gardens knew it well. Though it never made the lists of showy herbs, it was kept in shaded corners like a treasured tool. Unlike some of the other forgotten crops in this journey, marsh windwort wasn't often grown deliberately. It just appeared, faithfully, generously, in places where the land stayed wet and soft, on the banks of the village stream, alongside the cattails, beneath the hedgerow, where animals pushed past. Its presence meant the soil was alive. It meant that something good could grow in places others found inconvenient or unusable. In medieval times, nothing was wasted. Not space, not time, not the quiet miracle of a healing weed. So when marsh windwort showed up, it wasn't pulled out or ignored. It was welcomed, gathered, thanked. Beyond its medicine, the plant also held symbolic meaning. Some folk believed it was a protector, not just of wounds, but of spirit. They'd leave bundles of dried marsh windwort by the thresholds of their cottages to guard against wandering sickness. Others believed the plant could ward off nightmares, and it wasn't uncommon to find a few sprigs tucked beneath a child's pillow. It wasn't always called by its long woundful name. Some villagers had their own titles: healer's breath, streamleaf, the silent herb, names born of habit and affection, names whispered, not written. So what happened to it? Why does marsh woundwort no longer sit in our gardens or grow in the ditches outside town? Its disappearance came not from disdain, but from forgetting. As roads were paved and marshes drained, the places where it grew quietly vanished. As medicine evolved into bottled pills and sterilized hospitals, the need for a streambank healer felt obsolete. Nobody meant to erase it, it simply faded. But the marsh woundwort is still out there, still growing in damp corners of the world, still ready to help. In some places it's now called a weed, another green thing with no place in the modern world. But the soil remembers, the rivers remember, and sometimes, if you walk quietly along the edges of forgotten fields or pause beside a rain-fed ditch, you might catch a flash of its purple flower, like a soft flame against the green. It's a reminder that healing doesn't always come loud, that usefulness doesn't always wear a crown, and that the wisdom of the land, the real, quiet, patient wisdom, is never truly lost. So tonight let us lie back and imagine a world where marsh woundwort still grows beneath our windows, where we gather its leaves in early morning light, boil water in old iron kettles, and press warm poultices against our wounds, not just of the skin, but of the heart. Because sometimes, a forgotten herb from a muddy stream might be exactly what we need, and tomorrow we'll walk again into the garden of the past, to find what else was never really lost. The quiet magic of corn salad. If you were to walk along the edge of a frost-tipped field in early spring, just where the warmth of the sun meets the stubborn chill of winter, you might find something so delicate, so unassuming, that your eyes might pass over it completely. Nestled close to the earth, hiding in plain sight, would be a small tuft of soft green leaves. A rosette really, low to the soil, modest in every way. And yet, in medieval times, this little plant carried a quiet kind of magic. They called it corn salad, though not because it was made from corn or used in salads of the modern kind. The word corn once simply meant grain, and corn salad grew wild among the cereal fields, keeping company with wheat and rye. Sometimes it was known as lamb's lettuce, perhaps because it thrived in the cooler months when lambing season began, or maybe because sheep seemed especially fond of nibbling its tender greens. But whatever name it wore, this vegetable had a loyal place in the kitchens of peasants and the gardens of monks alike, and for good reason. Corn salad was one of the first greens to appear after the long medieval winter. Before modern refrigeration, before imported citrus or greenhouse kale, the arrival of these greens in late February or March was not just welcome, it was vital. After months of dried beans, root vegetables, and salted meats, the body longed for something fresh, something gentle and green. And there it was, humble little corn salad, with its mild nutty flavor and soft velvety texture. Unlike many vegetables that demand attention, corn salad asked for very little. It could grow on poor soil, it could survive a frost, it didn't mind the shade, nor the cold. In fact, it seemed to prefer the quiet when other plants still slept. Medieval gardeners knew this. They would scatter the seeds in autumn, just after the last harvest. The seeds would settle into the earth, resting through winter, then quietly germinating beneath the snow. When spring returned, so did the salad. Its leaves were gentle on the tongue, soft and yielding, not bitter like dandelion, nor peppery like arugula, just tender and mild, perfect for easing the stomach after a long season of hard food. It was served with vinegar and oil, or just as it came, gathered fresh by hand. Some added it to simple broths, or tucked it beside boiled eggs. Others ate it by itself, appreciating its subtlety, its calm presence. In monastery gardens where herbs and vegetables were grown for both healing and sustenance, corn salad had its own place. It was said to aid digestion and cool fevers, though its real gift might have been even simpler: nourishment with ease. It gave without fuss, without show. In a world that asked so much of the soil, corn salad gave quietly and early, when people needed it most. And yet, somewhere along the line, this faithful green began to vanish from everyday gardens. As spinach and lettuce rose in popularity, faster growing, flashier, easier to harvest in large amounts, corn salad retreated. It didn't compete well in industrial farming. Its leaves were too small, its harvest too delicate. In a world of big machines and plastic packaging, it faded into the background, but it never disappeared entirely. In pockets of France and Germany, especially in the countryside, corn salad still grows in old garden beds. In fact, in France, it's known as mâche, and remains a winter delicacy, harvested by hand, and sold in small bunches at local markets. The tradition never fully died, it just went quiet. There is something deeply comforting about that a plant can slip from common view, not because it failed or was flawed, but simply because the world turned too quickly, and that even now, if you stoop low enough, if you look closely enough, you might find it again. You might wander through an untended field, at the end of winter, the trees are bare, the ground still hard, and yet there, pressed close to the soil, a green rosette waits patiently, waiting as it always has for someone to remember it. You might kneel down and brush your fingers across the leaves, soft, cool, resilient, a gift from the earth that asks nothing in return. There's a kind of peace in knowing that this little green thing survived not by being strong or fast or loud, but by being gentle, by arriving early, by holding space for nourishment when the world was still cold and still. Corn salad, forgotten by many, remembered by few, still growing, still giving, and maybe, just maybe, still waiting for its moment to return. Let us take a moment then to remember the garden as it once was, not full of grand vegetables and dramatic flavors, but of quiet gifts like these. Greens that eased the hunger after winter, leaves that grew low to the ground, and asked for nothing but a patch of earth and a bit of sun. Let's remember that what we plant, and what we value, doesn't always have to be the biggest or the boldest. Sometimes the most lasting nourishment comes from what's soft, steady, and quietly waiting to be seen again. Orac, the salty green of ancient gardens, long before spinach conquered the garden beds of Europe, another leafy green reigned in its place, quietly, patiently, season after season. It wasn't flashy, it didn't bolt dramatically or demand elaborate care, but it was there, year after year, colouring the gardens of abbeys, cottage plots, and village commons in hues of soft green and deep red. The plant's name, Orac, sometimes spelled Orich, sometimes called mountain spinach, or Arak in the old texts. But whatever the name, the purpose was always the same: nourishment from the soil, even when the soil grew stubborn. Tonight, we walk the edges of an old monastic garden. The walls are moss-covered, the air is cool, and there, just beyond the path, rising beside the stone wall, is the humble Orac, forgotten by most, but once as common as bread. Let's step slowly now. The wind is soft, the soil is damp, and the past still lives beneath the leaves. You could spot Orac even from a distance. It didn't look like much to modern eyes, just a spindly, bushy plant, growing knee-high or more, with leaves that crinkled like crepe paper. But to the medieval farmer, Orac was more than green. It was insurance. Unlike spinach, which bolts in heat and demands cooler springs, Orac didn't mind the sun. It thrived in the dry warmth of summer. When spinach would turn bitter and burst into seed, Orac stayed tender, leafy, and generous. Its taste, mild, slightly salty, a trace of earth, a whisper of something sea-kissed. In a time before refrigeration, or even consistent access to salt, Orac was prized for this subtle briny flavor. It made bland meals livelier, and lean stews more satisfying. The leaves could be eaten raw in salads, or boiled into hearty broths, used like chard or young cabbage. The red-leaved varieties, particularly the deep burgundy ones, were even used as decoration on feast tables, woven among bread loaves and pitchers of ale. But Orac's real strength came in how easily it grew. Monks loved it, peasants relied on it, nobles rarely noticed it. But that's how it survived. Unlike other vegetables that required replanting every year, Orac often reseeded itself. Once introduced to a garden, it returned faithfully, softly, almost respectfully, without invading. A true guest in the soil. If you planted a few, you might find dozens the next year, springing up where you least expected. Orac respected the rhythms of the land. It didn't take over, it shared space, and in medieval gardens, space was everything. Let's walk a little farther now, past the kitchen garden's edge. Do you hear that? The soft rustle of tall stalks brushing one another in the evening breeze. Orac, once fully grown, can reach 4 feet tall. Thin seed heads rise from the tops, like feathery torches, catching the dusk light. In ancient times, these seeds weren't discarded. Medieval households gathered them, not just for next year's planting, but for food. You see, Orac isn't only a leaf vegetable, it's a grain too. Its seeds, tiny, flat and dark, could be dried, ground and used in porridge. Not a feast day dish, no, but filling, reliable. A handful mixed into oat cakes or thin barley gruel helped stretch a meal just a little further, and in times of famine, a little further could mean survival. Orac was one of those rare plants that offered food at every stage. Young leaves for salads, mature leaves for cooking, seeds for baking. Even the dried stalks were used for kindling or weaving into garden fences. For a humble plant, Orak did a great deal. Now imagine a small village, let's say it's late May, maybe early June. The hard root vegetables are nearly gone from the cellar, carrots are soft, cabbages long since soured, the spring greens haven't yet come fully in, spinach has bolted, lettuce is struggling in the sun. But Orak is standing tall, healthy and undeterred, its crinkled leaves catching the sun. A woman with a willow basket walks barefoot into the garden. She bends, selects the younger, tender leaves, pinching gently at the base. 1, 2, 3. Into the basket they go. She's not in a rush. The work is light. She hums. Later these greens will simmer in a pot with beans, a little onion, maybe a bit of broth. A meal with almost no cost, and all the comfort of nourishment. In a world without excess, a plant like Orak was wealth. But time, as it often does, moved on. When spinach gained favor, sweeter, more pliant, more familiar in taste, Orak was quietly demoted. Not banished, just forgotten. It was edged out by stronger marketing, bigger farming, and the rise of the perfect leaf. Spinach could be washed and bagged, sold and shipped. Orak, by contrast, had personality, didn't conform well to packaging. Its red-leaved cousins faded into rare curiosities. The green varieties returned to the wild, clinging to hedgerows and roadsides. Occasionally, a stubborn gardener kept it, maybe a monk in the countryside, a grandmother in France, a seed saver in Eastern Europe. But it stopped being common, stopped being necessary, and so it slipped away. Still the land remembers. Even now in forgotten corners of old stone gardens, you might find it. A spindly plant with leaves like faded velvet, rising quietly beside the wall. You may not recognize it. You might walk past, but it's there. The salty green of ancient gardens, waiting, not for fame, or even acknowledgement, just for a place in the soil, and a moment in the sun. Marsh, samphire, the saltwater green. There were places in the old world where the soil gave way, not to fields but to mudflats and shallow tides, where the sea met the land in a hush of brine and silt. These were not the fertile heartlands of medieval Europe, but the fringes, quiet, overlooked, and often avoided. Yet even here, nature gave its gifts. Among the salt-heavy air and shifting tides, a strange little plant thrived. Short, knobby, and vivid green, it looked like something from the sea itself, and in a way it was. Marsh samphire, sometimes called sea asparagus, glasswort, or simply salt herb, was a treasure growing where little else dared. Not in the lord's field or the peasant's kitchen garden, but in the tidal marshes where the rhythms of the sea dictated the harvest. It is said that medieval salt workers, who toiled under sun and wind collecting sea salt from brine pans, were the first to gather samphire in earnest. They'd find it pushing up through the mud in spring, bright green against the grey. To them, it was both a snack and a survival food, crunchy, salty, strangely satisfying. Others noticed too. Fishermen gathering mussels and clams would pick it as they walked. Shepherds driving flocks along the coastal paths nibbled at it. By summer, its flavour intensified. By autumn, it was red-tipped and ready for preserving. Marsh samphire never made it into the manor gardens. It didn't fit the neat rows or tilled beds. It couldn't be domesticated easily, and it didn't obey the rules of inland agriculture. But that didn't make it less valuable. In fact, its defiance of cultivation was part of its charm. It was a gift only to those who knew where to look and when to look. A food of the foragers, the wanderers, the tide watchers. Its uses went far beyond nibbling. Medieval cooks, those who lived near estuaries or brackish rivers, learned to boil it briefly and toss it with vinegar, preserving its sharp crunch. They layered it into pies with eel and trout. They served it with saltfish on feast days when meat was forbidden. And in more humble homes, samphire was pickled in barrels alongside cucumbers and onions, its bright green vanishing into the brine until winter came and the barrels were opened again. But samphire's story stretches beyond the kitchen. In the great glass furnaces of the medieval world, this plant held another secret. Burned to ash, samphire released soda ash, a critical ingredient in glassmaking. Glassblowers would send foragers to gather great bundles of the plant from the coast, drying it and burning it down to brittle white powder. It's strange to think of such a humble marsh herb helping to create cathedral windows and delicate goblets, but so it did. A link between mud and magnificence, sea marsh and stained glass. In medieval medicine, samphire earned its place in herbals too. It was thought to purify the blood, stimulate digestion, and relieve joint pain. Apothecaries steeped it in vinegar and wine, creating tonic drinks meant to cleanse the body after long winters of salted meats and little greens. It was sometimes crushed and made into poultices for wounds, particularly those with swelling or inflammation. Its briny sharpness seemed to cut through stagnation, waking the body after months of cold and quiet. And yet, despite all this, its culinary value, its medicinal promise, its contribution to craft, samphire slipped away from the pages of memory. As glassmaking changed, as inland trade brought more predictable greens, and as coastal life grew more industrial, the little plant lost its place at the table. Its seasonality, its wild nature, and its salty bite were out of sync with the newer tastes of the growing cities. People stopped foraging for it, recipes stopped mentioning it, the tides kept moving, but fewer feet wandered those muddy banks to find the green treasure nestled within. Today, a few still remember, in places like Norfolk, Brittany, and the Venetian lagoon, old hands still bend to gather samphire in the early light, slipping it into baskets before the tide returns. Its taste, a mix of sea and crunch, and something faintly ancient, remains unmistakable. You can still bite into it and feel the memory of those medieval shores where salt met soil and something quietly beautiful grew. So if you ever walk along a tidal flat at low tide and you see a patch of stubby green pushing up from the mud, know that you are seeing something rare, a survivor, a gift from a forgotten garden. Samphire doesn't ask to be planted, it doesn't demand cultivation, it just grows, faithfully, seasonally, and without fanfare, waiting for the right hands to remember it again, and now we do. Lovage. The tall whisper of savory sunlight. The morning mist clung low over the fields, a gentle blanket of silver fog stretching across the damp earth. In the half-light, everything seemed softened, edges of cottages blurred, trees faded into silhouettes, and footpaths disappeared into the pale veil, like thoughts into dreams. And somewhere beyond the hedgerow, behind a wattle fence long worn smooth by hand and time, a garden slowly stirred. There, in the far bed, rising above the cabbages hunched like sleepy green domes, and the trailing beans still curled from their hazel poles, stood a single towering plant. Its stalks were tall and hollow like reeds, with fine green leaves shaped like jagged lace. From a distance, it looked almost like an overgrown parsley, but its scent betrayed it, sharp, peppery, earthy, and strangely comforting. This was Lovage, a name once spoken as plainly as bread or firewood, now all but forgotten. But in the time of monasteries and hand-dug furrows, of cooking pots over open hearths and wind-blown thatch, Lovage was the voice of savory green flavor. It was a common companion to the humble meals of peasants and the structured diets of monks. In both stews and remedies, it played its part. Let's walk there slowly, into that quiet garden. Imagine the air is damp, and the smell of soil is rich beneath your boots. Each step releases the scent of crushed plant stems, wild thyme, chickweed, clover. Birds are still quiet, as if the sun hasn't quite arrived. You pass the bean bed, the onion rows, and there, near the corner where stones mark the border of the herb patch, is the tall shape of Lovage. It sways even when there's no wind. Its stalks are so light, they almost breathe on their own. You reach out and rub one of the leaves between your fingers. Immediately, the smell rises. It is not sweet, it is not shy, it is a deep, savory perfume, somewhere between celery and crushed bay leaf, but with its own wild intensity. This was why medieval cooks loved it. A pinch of Lovage leaf could transform a thin broth into something hearty. Its seeds could season bread, and its roots, steeped or pickled, added flavor and medicine in one. It was said to warm the body and settle the stomach, to lift melancholy, and to bring strength when the body felt thin. In the monastery gardens, Lovage was considered a sacred green. It was planted near the infirmary, near the cloister walls, in long raised beds where other medicinal herbs grew, wormwood, borage, betony, and meadowsweet. The monks recorded its virtues in soft Latin ink, Levisticum officinale, a purifier of the blood, a cleanser of the lungs, a herb of both body and spirit. It's easy to picture a friar, robe trailing through dew, scissors in hand, selecting a few stalks before the breakfast bell rang. And in the kitchen, stone walls blackened by centuries of smoke, a pot would already be warming. Barley and root vegetables, wild greens and Lovage, chopped fine. Even in peasant cottages, where meals were built from whatever grew nearby, Lovage was a blessing. A handful could season days' worth of pottage. The roots could be stored through winter, dried and sliced. Leaves were hung from beams to dry beside garlic and onions, tied in bundles with rush twine. Lovage was never wasted. It was too useful, too full of strength. In those days, gardens were not ornamental. They were lives made visible. Every row held meaning. Every plant had a reason. Lovage, tall and generous, often stood at the center of those herb beds like a green flag of continuity, growing tall when other plants stayed low, reminding gardeners that flavor, healing and survival were all part of the same rhythm. But time moved forward. The world changed. Celery arrived, softer in taste. Flavors were selected, refined, bred for subtler notes and longer storage. Lovage became too strong, too wild. Its name disappeared from market stalls. Its seeds stopped passing from hand to hand, and in many places it vanished entirely. Yet, not everywhere. In tucked-away gardens, in monastery remnants and family plots passed through generations, lovage still grows. It does not ask for much, just sunlight and damp soil. It returns year after year without fuss, and when it is cut, it comes back stronger, leafier, richer. It is a plant with memory. Let us imagine now a woman in her garden, her apron slightly damp from the morning dew, a basket swinging from her elbow. She cuts a few stalks of lovage and smiles, remembering how her grandmother always added it to broth on feast days. A scent rises, sharp and green, and it brings her back to childhood. Not just a place, but a feeling. That's what lovage does. It links people to the earth, and to each other. It carries time in its stems. Even its name hints at love. Lovage, from the Latin lavisticum, but also linked by old dialects to loveache, a plant once believed to stir the heart and spirit. There were spells and charms made from it, hung in doorways or worn in pockets. Some said it warded off envy, others said it encouraged boldness. It is, after all, a bold plant, not loud, but unashamed. It stands tall when others crouch. Its flavor doesn't hide, it declares itself, and perhaps in that, there's a lesson, that not all nourishment must be subtle. Some gifts from the soil are meant to stand proud. So if you find yourself near a garden, any garden, look for it, or plant it yourself. Touch its leaves, smell its roots, crush a seed in your palm and breathe deep. You may not need a tonic, you may not need a soup, but perhaps what you need is a whisper from the past, a sign that the garden still remembers, that somewhere in the language of herbs, lovage still speaks, and in the quiet, you may hear it say, "I have been waiting." Gromwell. The grain that wasn't. Not all the crops of the medieval world grew tall and golden in the open fields. Some whispered their presence at the edges, between hedgerows in rocky clearings, and tucked within narrow garden beds too small for grains like barley or rye. Gromwell was one of these, a modest, low-slung plant with pointed leaves and pale star-shaped flowers. It bore a secret that only the old herbalists and peasants remembered. Its hard little seeds, hidden in clusters near the roots, could be ground like grain. It was called stone seed by some, because of the polished smoothness of its nut-like seeds so firm they could spark against iron and make sparks fly. But for those who knew how to prepare it, Gromwell could be boiled, pounded, soaked, and eventually turned into a gruel that could fill the belly when little else remained. And sometimes, that was all a family needed to make it through the cold weeks of Lent or the hunger gaps before harvest. No one ever planted fields of Gromwell. It wasn't that kind of crop. It was foragers' food, hidden in plain sight. The sort of plant a wise grandmother would point out to a child walking a field's edge. "There," she'd say, kneeling down, brushing aside the grass. "That one, mind the roots. We'll come back when the seeds set." And when the time came, they'd gather a small basketful, never too much, never greedily. Gromwell rewarded the patient, not the hungry. It's easy now to overlook plants like this. In an age of plenty, where food comes in packages and aisles stretch on forever, a hard seed tucked under a weed doesn't sound like nourishment. But in the world of medieval peasants, monks and midwives, plants like Gromwell were not forgotten. They were studied, respected, quietly gathered season after season. They were the bridge between wild and cultivated, between desperation and ingenuity. Let's imagine a small holding, just a few strips of land beside a forested edge, with a cottage roof sagging slightly under the weight of moss. The family who lives here knows Gromwell well. Each spring, when the soil begins to wake, they mark the spots where it tends to grow. A child might tie a ribbon to a nearby branch, or scratch a sign into a stone. When the season turns, and the flowers give way to seeds, they'll return. The harvest is never large, a few handfuls, dried carefully near the hearth. But in winter, those handfuls matter. The seeds are cracked with a wooden pestle, never metal, lest the sparks fly, and soaked overnight. Boiled in a pot with leeks or lentils, they add weight to thin broth. They thicken porridge made from crushed acorns or barley. They give strength where otherwise there'd be none. But Gromwell wasn't just food, not entirely. In the monasteries, where plants were recorded in thick volumes of herbal knowledge, it was praised for other properties. Midwives knew it as a helper in childbirth, sometimes steeping the seeds in hot water to ease labor pains. Others believed it could soften stones in the body, kidney stones, bladder stones. Its Latin name, Lithospermum, even means stone seed, both for its look and for its supposed power over the hard things within us. There is something poetic in that, a plant that looks like stone, fighting stones inside the body, a crop that isn't quite a crop, feeding the poor when nothing else grows. It's no wonder that Gromwell slipped into legends too. In some corners of old Europe, it was said to protect against curses. Its hard seeds were strung into necklaces and tucked into pouches worn beneath the tunic, a charm for travelers, a ward against hunger. And yet, like so many others, Gromwell has faded from our view, forgotten not because it failed us, but because we moved on, because soft breads and white grains replaced the stubborn work of wild seed grinding, because supermarkets have no need for hedgerow crops. But if you walk an old path, far from the cities, where stone walls crumble and birdsong fills the silence, you might still see it, low to the ground, modest, waiting, its leaves long and slender, its flowers pale and easily missed, and beneath, the seeds hard, perfect, ancient, waiting for someone to remember. Sea beet, the wild grandmother of chard and spinach. Along the ragged coastlines of early medieval Europe, where the tides came in, not with fury, but with an old, sighing rhythm, there grew a plant so quiet, so modest, that it was rarely spoken of in song or story. Yet it endured through salt wind and famine, through lean seasons and long winters. It kept growing. Sea beet, they called it in later years. But those who lived by the sea, who knew the rocks and tasted the brine on the air, often didn't call it anything at all. It was simply there, as reliable as the returning tide. Imagine the shore in early spring, when the sea still held its winter chill, and the inland fields offered little more than damp soil, and the promise of green. The first shoots of sea beet, glossy and strong, would push their way up from the crevices in the rock and the soft earth, just beyond the tide line. Deep green with veins of purple or red, the leaves curled tightly at first, like fingers hesitant to open. But they grew quickly under the pale sunlight, soaking up warmth where they could find it against the backs of stones, along the folds of dunes, beside the driftwood that had long since lost its name. For coastal villagers and fisherfolk, the appearance of sea beet marked a turning. It meant food again, fresh food, not dried legumes or last year's grain, but something alive, something growing. And though it would never be the centerpiece of a feast, sea beet was a quiet kind of salvation. Peasants gathered it barefoot, often in the soft light of morning, before the sea wind picked up. The leaves were plucked with care, the strongest ones left behind so the plant would return. Little children were sent with woven baskets and simple instructions: bring back the tender ones, the smooth ones, and watch for the slugs hiding underneath. The old women, who remembered leaner times, taught them how to find the good patches, those where the sea's mist kissed the soil just enough, and the roots stretched deep into undisturbed ground. Cooked, it softened. Sea beet leaves were dropped into boiling water with a pinch of salt, and if fortune allowed, a spoonful of fat skimmed from the top of a meat stew. They were stirred slowly, folded over themselves until they darkened and wilted, their strong coastal flavor mellowing into something earthy and rich. Served with bread, or oats, or even just on their own, they filled the belly better than their appearance might suggest. They had weight, they had depth, and more importantly, they reminded people that winter always ends. In some households, the women knew how to preserve them. A stone jar filled with sea beet, chopped and blanched, was layered with herbs, wild garlic, mustard seeds, and the thin sliced root of whatever else grew nearby. Vinegar poured over it all, a cloth lid, tied tight with twine. These jars sat beneath benches, in root cellars, sometimes hidden behind cloth in the corners of cool cottages. A taste of spring, even in the heat of summer. There were places, monasteries mostly, where the monks recorded sea beet as Beta maritima, the sea's beet. They grew it alongside stranger plants, plants from Rome, from across the sea, brought by traders or carried in books. But sea beet asked for little. It didn't need tending. It didn't wilt easily. The monks respected that. They used it in broths for the sick, and in bitter decoctions thought to cleanse the humors. Its reputation was one of reliability, of healing, and of strength. But beyond the herbals and recipes, Sea beet lived in stories passed between generations, not written ones, but the kind whispered while fingers worked dough, or when feet walked slowly home from the shore. Some said the plant only grew where the sea had kissed the land with love. Others said its roots could pull sorrow from the body, if chewed in silence beneath a waning moon. These were stories carried not in books but in breath, in practice, in the way someone might turn their head at the wind, and say, "It's sea beet weather." It's easy to forget how powerful that kind of memory is. When history favors kings and knights and cloisters, who remembers the green things in the cracks of the rocks? Who remembers the woman gathering leaves before her children wake, or the boy who learns to wash them clean in the cold water of a stream? And yet without these quiet labors, what survives? Sea beet did, and more than that, it became something greater. Over the centuries, its lineage evolved into what we now know as chard, and later still, into the cultivated beet with swollen root and sugary flesh. It's strange to think, as you slice bright red beetroot for a salad, or saute glossy rainbow chard in a pan, that they all trace back to those wild coastal leaves, to those patient hands, to the salt-rich wind and the quiet, stooping figures along forgotten shores. Today you can still find sea beet where the land meets the sea. It doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't bloom in gold, or twist itself into exotic shapes, but it holds a kind of dignity, a remembrance of time before glass greenhouses and refrigerated trucks, before spinach came in plastic bags and food traveled farther than people ever did. It is the taste of salt and earth, of wind and survival. It is a chapter written in green, one that fed the poor, healed the weak, and waited patiently every spring to be found again. So if you ever walk the old shores of Britain, or France, or the quiet northern coasts where the land still meets the sea in hushed conversation, look for the leaves that gleam just a little more than the rest, touch them gently, and remember what they gave, without asking for anything in return. Ramsons. The wild garlic beneath the trees. Before the fields were neatly furrowed, before towns and parishes carved the land into names and deeds, there were the woods, deep, moss-shadowed, filled with birdsong and slow-drifting mist, in the old forests of Britain and beyond, where the deer moved silently and the undergrowth knew only moonlight and rot. There stirred a scent every spring that could not be mistaken. It came softly at first, on the backs of breezes and in the folds of cloaks, a green scent, bright, sharp, ancient, Ramsons. Wild garlic. They grew where the light reached through the canopy, where roots broke open the soil and water pooled after rain. Whole glades of them, thousands even standing close and thick as a crowd, their wide leaves like flattened spears, pale flowers nodding like a hush over the woodland floor. Walk through one of those glades in early spring, and the air itself changes. There is no mistaking it. The scent is part onion, part something older, something wilder. To the medieval peasant, Ramsons were a gift and a warning. A gift because food in spring was still scarce. Last year's stores were nearly gone, the first crops not yet ready, but here was flavor, medicine and green nourishment, offered freely and found not in a lord's storehouse or the coin-choked stalls of a distant market, but in the silence of the woods. And a warning too, because only the wise could distinguish wild garlic from its deadly lookalikes, lords and ladies, lily of the valley, plants that whispered poison beneath their beauty. But those who knew, the old herb women, the foragers, the barefoot children with sharp eyes and memories older than their years, they knew the difference. They gathered Ramsons before the flowers opened fully, when the leaves were soft and full of juice. They brought them home in bundles tied with grass, and laid them gently on stones outside the door, letting the bugs crawl out and the scent fill the air. In the cottage, they were chopped with bone knives or old blades passed down, mixed into stews, stirred into porridge, or crushed into a green paste with salt and oil, and a little ale if there was some to spare. No one called it a pesto, not then, but it served the same purpose: flavor, nourishment, a taste of the forest when all else was grey. Some used Ramsons as medicine. The monks did, certainly, writing of its power to cleanse the blood, to calm the stomach, to drive out phlegm and sorrow alike. But long before ink was spilled on parchment, the villagers knew what it could do. It soothed a cough. It brought heat to cold limbs. It reminded the body, gently, that winter had passed. It grew low and humble, with no thorns or grandeur, but it claimed the forest floor with quiet insistence. And when the white flowers came, they did not shout. They simply glowed like little stars in the shade. Bees came for them, and the bees told the trees, and the trees seemed to lean in. The smell of Ramsons wasn't just a sign of food, It was a sign of change. After long dark months of roots and salted meat, here was a plant that needed no taming. It sprang up from the same land where ancestors walked. It came back on its own. No need to plow or weed or sow. It was simply there, a gift, returning every year, waiting. Children knew to find them, often before their parents did. They ran into the woods barefoot and came back with green-stained hands, mouths smelling of onion. They made games of the flowers, daring each other to eat a petal, weaving chains of wild garlic blooms like they were daisies. The forest was their pantry, their playground, their classroom, and the animals knew too. Deer nibbled the leaves at dawn. Badgers dug where bulbs grew thick. Birds nested in the quiet above, their songs echoing down into the green stillness below. The people who lived close to the woods never truly forgot Ramsons. Even when towns grew, even when bread became the staple and meat a mark of wealth, those who remembered the old ways kept to the edges of the woods. They passed the knowledge quietly, a leaf folded in a child's pocket, a jar of green paste left on a neighbor's windowsill, a tale told by firelight of how grandmother survived the lean years. There were seasons when Ramsons were the difference between hunger and health, times when sickness swept through villages and nothing seemed to help, but a hot broth with wild garlic lifted the weight from the chest, brought color back to cheeks. Whether it was magic or simply minerals, no one cared. It worked. It's strange to think how many hands have pulled these same leaves from the same damp soil, how many generations, uncounted and unnamed, have knelt in the green hush of morning to gather food from a forest that still gives. The names may change, the borders may shift, but the scent remains, deep, vital, unmistakable. There are still places today, quiet hollows and secret woods, where Ramsons rise each year like they always have. Their scent carries stories you can't quite hear, but can almost remember. A memory of survival, a gift from the trees, and a promise, whispered each spring, that the land still knows how to feed us. And if you ever find yourself walking in a wood and catch the sharp wild scent of something old and green, stop, breathe, you're not alone. The Ramsons remember. Colt's Foot, the soothing bloom beneath the snow. If you were to walk the frost-bitten edges of a medieval path, just as winter gives way to spring, before even the snowdrops or daffodils dare lift their heads, you might stumble upon a strange little flower blooming against the odds, a golden, sun-like blossom perched low on the ground, with no visible leaves in sight. This was Colt's Foot. To the eyes of a passing traveller, it might have seemed like a weed or an early dandelion, blooming in ditches and roadsides, but to a medieval herbalist or a peasant nursemaid, it was the first medicine of the new year, the voice of the earth returning to life, and one of the most vital plants in their quiet arsenal of survival. Colt's Foot was among the very first plants to flower after winter, often pushing its way up through crusted snow, sprouting golden blooms before it even produced leaves. In a time when fresh food and greenery were rare, when larders were bare and children wheezed with the remnants of winter colds, Colt's Foot meant hope. It meant warmth was coming. Its name, Colt's Foot, comes from the hoof-shaped leaves that appear later in the season, broad and flat like the print of a young horse in the mud. But by the time those leaves unfurled, the flowers were long gone. The plant reversed the usual order, bloom first, leaf later, and that alone made it special in the eyes of medieval people. Physicians and apothecaries from as early as the Roman era praised Colt's Foot for its remarkable soothing properties. The dried leaves, when burned and inhaled, helped ease stubborn coughs. The flowers were steeped in wine or honey to make syrups for sore throats. Some monks even kept jars of Colt's Foot infused honey by their bedsides to ward off the midnight fits of coughing that plagued so many in the cold stone monasteries. In the homes of peasants, mothers would brew Colt's Foot tea from the dried leaves and blossoms, offering it by the fire to sick children or elderly parents. A compress of Colt's Foot was laid across the chest to ease labored breathing. In the countryside, it earned a name as coughwort for this very reason, a simple, lowly flower that held back the worst of winter's long shadow. But Colt's Foot was more than just a medicine, it had symbolic power. In many villages, spotting the first Colt's Foot flower was considered a lucky omen, a sign that the dark half of the year was ending. Children were told to make a wish on the first blossom they saw. Old traditions whispered that if you carried a dried Colt's Foot bloom in your pouch, it could protect you from chest illnesses, or bring healing dreams. Colt's Foot was also a favorite of medieval bees. These bright, early blossoms gave honeybees one of their first tastes of nectar in the cold spring. Beekeepers planted them along the edges of meadows and monastery gardens, knowing that their golden tufts would lure the bees from their hives earlier than most flowers dared. The honey produced was said to carry a delicate floral scent, like the memory of spring itself. Despite its many virtues, coltsfoot gradually fell from grace. With the rise of regulated medicine and changing agricultural practices, wild herbs like coltsfoot were deemed unpredictable, unscientific, or simply unprofitable. Its blooms became things to weed out, not to welcome. The roadside gold was overlooked for imported tonics and over-the-counter syrups. Even more damning, modern studies discovered that coltsfoot contains small amounts of naturally occurring alkaloids that, in large quantities or over long periods, may affect the liver. And so, this once beloved healer was labeled unsafe in some modern herbal circles, its long history eclipsed by a few chemical warnings. But the medieval world did not have the luxury of choosing between herbs and lab-grown cures. They used what the land gave them, carefully, seasonally, wisely. Coltsfoot, when used in moderation, was not a danger, it was a lifeline. Today, you can still find coltsfoot blooming in forgotten places, along canal paths, abandoned fields, and the shoulders of country roads. If you happen to see its golden star-shaped flowers rising from bare earth before the leaves of spring return, you might feel something stir in you, a memory you never had, of soot-warmed stone cottages and herbal bundles hung over fireplaces. You may even wonder what it tasted like, the soft bitterness of the leaves, the sweetened tea, made with flowers and honey. You may imagine your breath easing, your chest loosening, warmed not only by the plant, but by the story of it, a tale as old as frost and fire, remembered in the very first bloom of the year. Coltsfoot does not ask for much. It does not want cultivation, attention, or admiration. It simply returns, again and again, to the same quiet places. It grows where others won't. And perhaps that is the lesson of coltsfoot: resilience in small forms, hope in the hidden edges of the world. Not every forgotten vegetable fed the stomach. Some, like coltsfoot, fed the breath, fed the soul. And in the long quiet nights of early spring, when the world was still more winter than warmth, it reminded medieval hearts that healing could grow from the cracks of even the coldest earth. The Garden of Forgotten Vegetables is not just a story of nutrition, it is a story of relationship, of how people once listened to what the land offered and answered with gratitude, with care, and with the soft rhythm of seasonal trust. Turnip-rooted chervil, the sweet secret of monastery gardens. In the dim hush of a medieval monastery garden, just beyond the stone path, where incense mingles with damp earth, there grew a small, humble root known to few but cherished by many. Its leaves were delicate, lacy, softly serrated like young parsley, and its roots, buried beneath the cool soil, were round and pale, no larger than a robin's egg. This was turnip-rooted chervil, Cherophyllum bulbosum, a quiet ghost among vegetables, lingering in the memory of those who once depended on its subtle sweetness. It wasn't planted in neat vines or neatly furrowed rows, rather in narrow beds hidden behind the monastery walls. It grew at its own pace, patient, unnoticed, but persistent. Monks, those keepers of slow wisdom, sowed the seed and left it to sleep for a season or two, knowing it thrived only when left undisturbed. Some gardens held roots planted a year earlier, others from 2 years past, each cycle unfolding in its own time. By late autumn, when most crops sang of storage and abundance, chervil stood quietly in the soil, protected from frost, its flavor deepening with every chill. Then came the true moment of harvest, a solemn night of fasting, or the eve of a feast. A gardener, perhaps Brother Peter or Sister Lysandra, came before dawn with a hand spade, gently lifted the root, brushed off the earth, and carried it into the kitchen by lamplight. In the raised hearth, coals glowed amber. The root was roasted in embers until its skin blushed gold, or simmered slowly in milk and fresh herbs. The result was richer than any common root, earthy and warm, yet sweet in a low, tender way. It was not sugar, but sustenance, soft nourishment for weary bodies, reminding them that delicate virtue could live alongside austerity. In time, stories grew around the food. The gentle root of chervil was said to cure melancholy, ease digestion, mend broken spirits. Mothers brewed tea for teething babes. Healers made ointments to soothe inflamed skin. Its power wasn't in strength, but in gentleness, an echo of the garden's serene hush, carried into each bite. Outside the monastery walls, villagers prized the root too. In stone cottages, it grew alongside leeks, peas and cabbage. In winter, when the stores were low and the winds rattled windows, they'd roast the root in embers, eat it with barley pudding, or bake it with apple slices. Each touch of sweetness felt like a prayer. But history moved faster than patience. In the centuries that followed, potatoes arrived from distant shores, hardy, large, reliable. Carrots and parsnips crowded the garden beds. Turnip-rooted chervil, needing slow seasons and silent tending, faded. Its seed vanished from catalogues. Its name dropped from records. Yet it survived quietly, in shady borders and devoted hands. In parts of eastern France or Bavaria, old gardeners still whisper its story. Each spring, slender seedlings sprout, their leaves whispering tales of past seasons. To taste, when finally harvested, is faintly sweet, gently warm, less distinct than museum notes, more rooted in soil than memory. It is a leaf from an old story, still speaking. So imagine it now. You kneel by a moss-covered stone wall in a monastery garden. Dawn fog drifts. The air is cool and hushed. You steady a spade, lift the soil, and find a small round root, the fruit of patience. You carry it inside, wash it slowly, roast it carefully. Then, warmed by coals and fragrant herbs, you taste, not for novelty or extravagance, but for quiet remembrance, of gardens that grew in silence, of seasons that needed time, of a sweetness earned, not conjured. In that moment, you are part of a line of hands stretching across centuries, gardens built in stone and earth, kitchens warmed by embers, hearts held in patience, and the root, humble though it is, speaks softly of a care that endures. Nodding onions, the gentle lanterns of the garden. Somewhere between the untamed corners of forgotten pastures and the margins of cultivated beds, the nodding onion once swayed gently in the breeze, a small and subtle signal to the world that nourishment could arrive quietly. It didn't trumpet its usefulness. It didn't demand the center of the garden like cabbage or leek, but it was there, humble, patient, and loved. The name alone tells you something, a plant that nods, not one that shouts. In medieval Europe, especially in the cooler, wind-swept regions where life was harder and meals were simpler, nodding onions became the sort of companion that appeared again and again, year after year, often uninvited, but always welcome. Unlike the grand bulbs we now associate with onions, those tear-inducing staples in kitchens the world over, this plant bore clusters of small tear-shaped bulbs and narrow leaves, and when it bloomed, its long stem arched gracefully, letting its lilac-pink flowers droop downward like a lantern. In monastery gardens, where silence was sacred and time moved slowly, monks grew nodding onions for both their usefulness and their beauty. Some herbal texts from the 12th century list Allium cernum among the herbs that were to be harvested carefully, their narrow leaves cut with a small knife and dried in the sun. The bulbs too were valued, but less for their intensity and more for their gentle, lingering warmth. In stews they added depth, in medicine they added healing. What made the nodding onion so perfect for medieval life was not just its taste, but its persistence. It grew in places where other crops might struggle, thin soil, rocky ridges, untended patches behind the house. Once established, it returned each year, nodding to the wind, bowing to the rain, and quietly offering itself up to those who knew its worth. You can imagine a barefoot peasant woman, apron tucked high and hands earth darkened, bending to pull a handful of the nodding onion's slender bulbs from the ground. She might add them to a simple broth, or tuck them beside a cut of salted pork, but she might also string the drying flower heads into a soft little garland and hang them above the hearth, not just for the flavor they would give later in the season, but because they looked like something kind. The nodding onion's real gift, though, might be found in its timing. It bloomed late in summer, often when the garden was beginning to quiet down. When other plants had finished their show, the nodding onion rose, delicate, fragrant, humming with bees. Medieval beekeepers cherished its flowers for the way they called to pollinators, and in an age before synthetic flavorings or imported spices, the soft, garlicky sweet taste of its bulb was precious. In regions where winter arrived early, the nodding onion was often among the last green things to be harvested. Folk traditions in parts of Britain, Normandy, and the lower German valleys tell of onion watches, in which entire families would spend an evening gathering bulbs by lantern light, hoping to store enough to dry through winter. Children would help bundle the stems, and some families would braid them together into long strings to hang from beams, both to dry and to guard against spirits, as nodding onions were sometimes considered protective plants. It wasn't just peasants or monks who grew them. In the herbal records of Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess and healer from the 12th century, there are mentions of a slender flowering onion that aided with inflammation and was used to treat infections of the throat and lungs. Some modern herbalists believe she was referring to the nodding onion, though it is hard to be sure. What is clear is that this unassuming plant earned a place in both the humble kitchen and the learned apothecary. So why did we forget it? in part because it asked for so little. The nodding onion didn't scale up well for modern agriculture. Its bulbs were small, its growing habit unpredictable, and its harvest time, late and staggered, didn't lend itself to mechanized tools or tidy distribution schedules. Celery, leeks, and larger onion cultivars pushed their way to the front of the market stalls, while the gentle nodding onion stepped quietly back. But in recent years, some growers and foragers have begun to whisper about it again. In permaculture circles, and among wild food enthusiasts, Allium cernum is once again being sown, not as a cash crop, but as a gift to the soil and the soul. Because when you walk through a garden and see those graceful stems bowing beneath soft pink blooms, it's hard not to slow down, to notice, to wonder. And that's what the nodding onion has always asked, to be seen gently in its own time. In the forgotten corners of medieval life, where hard work and hope lived side by side, this little plant offered just enough. A handful of warmth for the pot, a string of sweetness for the rafters, a cluster of flowers for the bees. It nodded not in surrender, but in peace. And maybe, as we dig deeper into these forgotten vegetables, that is what we're really uncovering. Not just food, but peace, quiet nourishment, tucked gently beneath the surface. Chickpeas, the humble pulse with a warrior's past. Before chickpeas filled salad bowls and lined the shelves of modern health stores, before hummus became a household name, and long before global trade routes made exotic legumes commonplace, there was the quiet clatter of peas poured into clay jars, counted carefully in cottage kitchens and monastery storerooms. Chickpeas, known to the Romans as cica, and to medieval herbalists as a cure-all pulse, held a place of quiet strength in the tapestry of medieval agriculture. They didn't stand tall like rye, nor shimmer golden like barley in the wind, but chickpeas were part of the bedrock of sustenance. Their resilience was legendary. These tiny wrinkled spheres could endure drought, poor soil, and long storage, making them a vital lifeline for those whose lives hung on the mercy of seasons. To plant chickpeas was to invest in stability, not abundance or luxury, but endurance. In the eastern reaches of the Mediterranean world, where the memory of Roman legions still lingered in stone roads and broken aqueducts, chickpeas had already been part of the diet for centuries. But by the medieval period, they had also worked their way into the farthest corners of European peasant life. In the hilly farms of Castile, in the wind-worn coastlines of Sicily, and in the sun-cracked gardens of Provence, chickpeas crept steadily into the diet, not just as food, but as a symbol. They were, after all, shaped like tiny helmets. Some folk tales even claimed they gave courage to those who ate them. And indeed, medieval soldiers on the move might carry dried chickpeas in pouches, softening them in water when meals were scarce. In the long Lent seasons, when meat was forbidden, and energy was still needed for field and forge, chickpeas became a protein-rich stand-in, an edible bridge between hunger and fullness. But it was in the monastic gardens, where chickpeas found a kind of reverence. Monks who kept to a plain diet often praised the chickpea for its humility. It cooked slowly, held flavor well, and blended with herbs grown nearby, thyme, savory, and lovage, to make hearty broths and nourishing potages. In some old accounts, chickpeas were even roasted in stone ovens and ground into a meal, pressed into cakes that traveled well and lasted long. The plant itself is not showy. Its stems are fragile, its leaves small, its flowers quiet, usually a pale pink or violet, nodding low beneath the summer sun. But beneath the earth, the treasure grows small stony pods containing 1 or 2 peas at most, each one a little package of energy, carried by pilgrims, baked by villagers, stored by widows for the months when snow made fields barren. Some believed chickpeas could draw out fevers, others used them ground with vinegar, as a salve for tired limbs, and in parts of rural England, a chickpea was carried in the pocket as a charm against fatigue during long travel. So what happened to the chickpea's story? Like many of its humble peers, it was eventually overshadowed by crops more amenable to mechanized farming, by larger legumes, by the lure of imported luxuries. But in truth, the chickpea never fully vanished. It simply stepped sideways, staying on quietly in corners of Europe where old recipes lingered, and in gardens where tradition meant more than profit. Today, we know it as a staple once again, its virtues rediscovered, its past often unspoken. But if you look closely, in the wrinkled surface of each little pulse, you can still see something older than modern taste. You can see the long winters it once outlasted, the hands that sorted it by firelight, the monks who stirred it into thick stews before the morning bell, and the children who counted each one into the pot as though they were beads of gold. Because for those who lived by the seasons, a chickpea was not just food, it was time, survival, and a kind of quiet magic, grown not for grandeur, but for peace, warmth, and continuity. And like many plants we are remembering now, the chickpea didn't demand to be remembered, it simply waited. Let's keep walking this quiet garden path, and see what ancient nourishment still lies ahead. Lentils, the little discs that fed empires, in the cradle of forgotten soil, where footprints of monks, peasants, and pilgrims once pressed into the earth, there thrived a pulse so modest, so enduring, that it quietly carried empires on its back. The lentil, small, lens-shaped, and humbly coloured in shades of brown, green, or gold, was never the loudest voice in the garden, but it was often the most faithful. By the time of the medieval world, lentils were already ancient. Grown since the days of Mesopotamia, they journeyed west with soldiers, east with monks, and north with trade routes that snaked through mountains and across rivers. They arrived in the kitchen gardens of medieval Europe, not as novelties, but as necessities. If you wandered into the garden of a 12th century abbey, past rows of sage and rue, beyond the leafy greens and drying herbs, you might find a patch of lentils in a corner that received full sun. Monks prized them, not just because they grew in poor soil, needing little, but because they fed many. On fast days, when meat was forbidden, lentils became the monk's salvation, boiled with leeks, stirred with garlic, sometimes eaten cold with a touch of vinegar. It was said a small bowl could carry a man until morning. In the villages, lentils were just as cherished. A peasant woman, with hands weathered from tending both children and beasts, might soak them overnight in a clay pot, waking early to cook them slow with whatever root or green she had on hand. Their flavour deepened the longer they simmered, like patience made edible. And when the harvest failed, lentils endured. They could be dried, stored, traded. Lentils didn't spoil, they didn't protest, they simply waited. In times of famine, they were counted out by hand. In times of feast, they appeared beside roasted birds or woven into bread. Children played with them, elders blessed them, and healers sometimes crushed them into poultices to soothe fevers and draw out infection. But perhaps the lentil's true power lay not in what it offered in moments of plenty, but in its loyalty through lean years. Unlike wheat, which needed tending, or barley, which was fickle with rain, the lentil asked little, and in return, it gave protein, strength, warmth. Even the ash from burned lentil stalks was said to enrich the soil. Across the Channel in England, across the hills of Burgundy, even on the rocky outposts of Gaelic Ireland, lentils found their way into pots and prayers. They were never fashionable, but they were trusted, and in a world of shifting borders, failed crops, and long winters, trust was everything. Today, as we spoon them into modern soups or press them into flatbreads, we rarely pause to remember that these little discs were once tokens of survival. They carried soldiers through sieges, they fed the sick, they filled the bellies of the poor, and the pious alike. The lentil may be small, but its legacy is vast. It speaks not of glory, but of steadiness, and in a world so often bent on spectacle, its quiet endurance offers something deeper, something grounding. We leave this chapter with a question not of what we can extract from the land, but what we might learn from the things that stay with us, quietly, season after season. Let us continue walking through the fields. There are still more seeds beneath the soil, waiting to speak. Chervil root, the winter's gentle secret. Beneath the frost-covered ground of a medieval garden, where iron spades struck gently through half-frozen soil, there lived a pale and slender root that few today would recognize. Chervil root, Charophyllum bulbosum, a soft-spoken cousin of carrots and parsnips, once treasured in the quiet months of winter, now nearly lost to time. It didn't look like much, short, spindle-shaped, and slightly wrinkled, with skin the color of old parchment. But inside, if harvested late and cooked slowly, it was a revelation, sweet as chestnut, silky as turnip, somewhere between potato and nutmeg, with a hint of warmth that lingered on the tongue. Chervil root was the kind of food you only appreciated if you'd known true hunger, or the hush of an empty field in December. In medieval kitchens, it was a root of patience, not fast to sprout, not easy to harvest. It took nearly a full season to swell beneath the earth, and only after the first frost had softened its starches into sugars was it truly ready. But once unearthed, it was prized, boiled in salted water, mashed into a thick paste with butter and herbs, or roasted on hot stones beside the fire. Peasants grew it where they could, between rows of rye, in odd corners of the garden, in the dappled shade beside root cellars. Nobles too had it tended in their kitchen plots, though they called it by softer names, sweet root or snow chervil. Monks included it in their physic gardens, noting not only its nourishment, but its supposed cooling properties, useful for tempering fevers and quieting the stomach. Some herbals from the 13th century list chervil root among those vegetables, considered both edible and medicinal. In a world where nutrition was often gleaned from whatever one could gather, the dual-purpose plants, those that fed and healed, held a special place. Chervil root tea was believed to help with digestion, and poultices of its mashed root were laid over sore joints and swollen fingers after long days spent in the fields. Its growing habit was shy, never flourishing in the open sun, but preferring partial shade, cooler ground and loamy soil. In some regions, farmers would plant it near the bases of trees or the edges of hedgerows, where the canopy broke up the summer heat. The seeds needed a long period of cold to germinate, so the careful gardener would sow them in autumn, and trust the snow to do its work. As the months passed and the soil froze, families would visit their stores, opening the cool cellars to check on their roots. Chervil root kept well when packed in sand or straw, its flavor deepening, its sweetness concentrating. It was sometimes offered to guests in winter feasts, served alongside boiled eggs or baked in pies with crumbled cheese and preserved apple. There are recipes, written in the margins of dusty medieval manuscripts, that call for chervil root to be stewed with barley, or mashed and rolled into small cakes, which were then pan-fried in goose fat, and served with pickled cabbage. Its versatility made it beloved, even if its fragile nature kept it from the broader tables of later centuries. Children, growing up in the cold stone houses of rural villages, learned to dig for chervil root by feel, knowing how to pull gently, not to snap the narrow taproot. They'd carry the roots in baskets of moss, warming them by the fire before dinner. In some regions, the winter solstice brought small rituals involving the last of the stored roots. Parents would roast them in silence, marking the quiet return of light after the year's darkest night. But like so many other medieval treasures, chervil root began to vanish with time. The rise of easier-to-grow vegetables, imported crops, and mass-market agriculture left it behind. It required trust, patience, soil that wasn't pushed for maximum yield, and so it faded, first from farms, then from seed stores, and finally from memory. Yet in a few quiet gardens today, it has returned. Enthusiasts and heirloom seed keepers, committed to reviving the flavors of the past, have coaxed it back from obscurity. Each plant takes time, each harvest is small, but with it comes the return of something precious, not just a forgotten food, but a way of living that honors slowness, seasonality and care. To each chervil root is to remember a world where food took time, where winter was not simply endured but gently embraced, where sweetness came not from sugar, but from the soft turning of starches underground. And as we walk through this garden of lost vegetables, let chervil root remind us, some treasures are not bold, they do not shout their worth, they lie quietly, waiting to be found again by those willing to kneel down, push aside the frost, and reach. The soil still remembers, do we? Horehound, the bitter healer of field and fire. There are plants that sing sweet songs in the garden. Lavender, with its fragrant hum, mint with its sharp and joyful sprawl, and then there is horehound, the old herb that hums in a lower key. Bitter on the tongue, rough to the touch, and grey-green like forgotten stone. Horehound was never the star of the garden, but it was there, always, steady, useful, and trusted in ways that sweet herbs never had to be. In the winding lanes between medieval villages, where dust rose with passing hooves and smoke curled gently from turf-covered homes, horehound often grew untamed by the roadside. It didn't need coaxing, no careful tending or rich soil, just sun, a patch of earth, and time. Its leaves, pale and wrinkled, like the pages of a well-thumbed book, carried a scent that was sharp and herbal, and the taste, if you dared to chew it raw, was bold and biting, like a warning. This was not a treat, it was medicine. In monastery gardens and peasant plots alike, horehound earned its place not for beauty, but for what it could do. Long before pills or syrups, before lozenges came in shiny wrappers, this bitter herb was the guardian of the lungs. Coughs, colds, fevers, even the mysterious winter humours, horehound was stirred into decoctions, boiled with honey, and pressed into tonics for every ailment of the chest. It was often among the first plants to be gathered, as summer leaned into autumn. A hedge witch might dry its leaves over the hearth, or steep them in wine, or mix them with vinegar and thick treacle to make a cough syrup as dark as night. Children hated it, But they drank it anyway, because they had to, because mother said so, because the wise woman said so, because the monk with the herb-stained fingers handed them a bundle of it, with instructions to chew slowly, even when it made their eyes water. Horehound was not a comfort, it was a cure. But there is something comforting about cures that come from the earth. In the smallest huts, where wind slipped through the thatch and illness came quickly, Horehound stood its ground. Not flashy like rose hips, not aromatic like thyme. It was the bitter backbone of old-world healing, a quiet promise in bitter leaves. In some parts of England, the herb was called seed of the horse. In others, it was Harl Hoon, a word that sounds like it belongs in an old lullaby, or a tale told by firelight. Roman texts mention it too, calling it Marubium, and praising its value as a healer. Ancient herbalists like Dioscorides and Pliny the Elder described it with care, warning about the strength of its bitterness, but noting its unmatched power against thick phlegm and labored breath. Even in times of plague, Horehound was not forgotten. When fear clung to the air, and doors were marked in chalk, and people passed silently with kerchiefs tied tightly to their faces, Horehound found its way into bundles of herbs hung in doorways, part superstition, part medicine, all hope. And there was more to it, not just for the lungs or the stomach, or the shivering body curled beneath woolen blankets. Horehound was believed to have protective properties. Some said it kept away serpents, others used it in smoke rituals, burning it like incense to ward off illness from a sick room. A few believed that the bitter smoke itself confused the devil, kept dark spirits from settling too long near a home. Whether true or not, what mattered was the trust. Trust in a herb that never pretended to be pleasant. Walk through a wild field in late summer, and you might still find it. Dusty, wind-tossed, low to the ground but unwavering. The sort of plant you almost miss unless you're looking. Its small white flowers grow in tight clusters, its square stems mark it as a member of the mint family, though no mint ever tasted like this. If you crushed the leaf in your hand and breathed deep, you might smell something ancient, something sharp, like forgotten medicine, or the corner of an apothecary shelf untouched by modern air. Some say it's making a return, that among herbalists, cough drop makers, and foragers, Horehound is being rediscovered. The candies of old, hard, dark and slightly sweetened with honey, are finding their way back into jars at folk shops and market stalls. But it's not about novelty, it's about memory, about going back to a time when medicine came with stories and every cure was part of a ritual. The boiling, the steeping, the waiting, the sip. Picture the medieval firelight, flickering against the stone, a clay pot on the boil, Horehound steeping gently, sending its bitter scent into the cold air, the healer's hand stirring slowly, knowing just when it's ready, a child coughing softly under a woven blanket, a mother waiting, a sip given, bitter, but better. That was Horehound's place, not glamour, not sweetness, just the steady hand of the garden, the reminder that not all healing is soft, some of it must be earned, swallowed, endured. And so in the long list of lost vegetables and herbs, Horehound remains a testament, not just to survival, but to trust. Trust in the old ways, in bitter roots, in strong flavors, in the strange and steady plants that still grow in the margins, waiting to be remembered. So let's not forget it. Let's keep walking this garden of the past, where bitter things still hold the cure. Fennel, the whispering herb of the marshes. There were places in the medieval countryside that most people passed quickly, heads down and cloaks drawn tight. The marshes, wet, whispering, and never entirely still, these boggy places lay between villages and across low valleys like a damp sigh. But even in these uneasy lands, life grew, not just moss and frogbit, but food, medicine, and fennel. Not the garden fennel of noble kitchens, grown tall and proper near garden paths, but fennel, the wild cousin, tougher, leaner, with a bitter backbone and a scent that clung to the wind like anise and salt. This was a plant for those who walked the boundaries, for foragers and marshland folk who knew how to find the good in forgotten places. Fennel didn't thrive in tilled soil. It liked its roots wet, its leaves bathed in mist, and its stalks swaying near the reeds. It grew at the edge of things, sometimes half submerged, sometimes hidden in thickets. But to those who knew its shape, the feathery green, the narrow flowers, the hollow stems, it was unmistakable, and useful. In the marshland hamlets where the land was too soaked for wheat and too low for sheep, fennel became part of the way people lived. The bulbs, though smaller than their garden cousins, were gathered in late summer and early autumn, chopped finely, They lent a strange, sweet bitterness to stews made of eel or perch, caught just yards from the house. The seeds were treasured too, dried on rush mats, then kept in wooden boxes for the cold months, a pinch in the bread dough, a sprinkle in cider, a brew for the stomach, when food sat heavy. Children sometimes chewed the stalks like licorice, old women boiled them to ease wind, and in the quiet, candlelit corners of sick rooms, fennel steam curled into the air, to ease breathing, to soften sorrow. Because in marsh villages, sorrow came often. The bogs hid dangers, fevers, missteps, things that vanished in the night. But fennel remained. It was even used to bless the thresholds of homes. On Midsummer's Eve, bundles of fennel and meadow sweet were tied to doors to keep away spirits said to rise from the water. And in some places, fennel was planted near the burial mounds of children, the seeds scattered softly by mourning hands. A way to sweeten the air for the lost, to mark the place where grief rooted itself beside life. And still, fennel came back. Year after year, it didn't care for wealth or rank. It asked for no wall or garden row, it simply grew. It endured, in mud, in mist, in memory. So if you ever walk a country lane where the road sinks low, and the air grows cool, look for the feathery green. It might be hiding by the ditch, or leaning near a fence post. You might not see it right away. But if you stop, if you wait, if you breathe deep enough, you might catch a scent of something older than paths and maps, the ghost of a herb that fed the edges, and in that quiet moment, between the earth and the fog, you might hear what the marsh always knew, that even in sorrow sweetness can grow. Sorrel, the tang of the commons. Sorrel was not planted with ceremony. It didn't arrive in velvet pouches or gilded carts. It was simply there, pushing its tart green leaves up through the soil of commons and fields, poking between stones, thriving where little else could. In the great and small lives of medieval Europe, sorrel was a constant whisper of flavor, a perennial plant that asked for nothing and gave everything. Its taste was unmistakable, sharp, lemony, almost electric. To bite into a fresh leaf was to wake the tongue from winter. It was not the tame sweetness of garden peas or the soothing blandness of barley. Sorrel sang, and in a time when meals were often repetitive, when salt and smoke were the dominant preservatives and stews might taste the same for weeks, sorrel was relief. Children learned early which leaves to pick and which to leave. Too old, and they grew tough. Too young, and their tang lacked fire. The right sorrel leaf, gathered before midday, could transform broth. Mixed with wild leeks, it made a green pottage sharp enough to chase away the dullness of preserved fare. In fish dishes, it was prized. Its acidity cut through the oil, and in fasting seasons when meat was forbidden, a sorrel and egg pie might be the finest thing set on the board. Not only was sorrel useful, but it was also persistent. In the long list of medieval kitchen herbs, it had no equal in terms of resilience. In boggy fields and dry hedgerows, along sheep tracks and behind cottage kitchens, it rooted and returned again and again through drought, flood and frost. Herbalists praised its qualities too. They claimed it cooled fever, calmed the liver, and chased away melancholy. Sorrel was used in poultices for inflammation, in tonics for appetite, and in charms for protection. Monks grew it in physic gardens, and peasants let it grow wherever it wished. Even nobles, despite favoring imported spices and rare fruits, kept a patch of sorrel near the kitchens. The plant's humility was its strength. It didn't demand fencing or tending. It needed no grafting, no pruning. The people of the land knew it by many names: sorrel, sourdock, green sauce. In Wales, it appeared in midsummer feasts. In Brittany, it featured in stews. In German-speaking regions, it made its way into dumplings and thick green sauces. But despite its ubiquity, sorrel slowly faded from elite tables. As trade expanded and lemons and vinegar became common, as spinach and chard were bred for milder flavors, sorrel was pushed aside. It was too wild, too sharp, too assertive. It became a weed to some, a memory to others. Yet in forgotten gardens, it still grows. Its leaves still carry that jolt of green electricity, and for those who seek it out, in meadows near riverbanks, or tucked into the edges of ancient hedgerows, it still offers the same gift it gave centuries ago: brightness. Not sweetness, not richness, but brightness, a flavor like waking up. And perhaps that's what made sorrel so vital in the medieval diet. In a world of browns and greys, of salted meats and dried grains, it was the color green, not just in shade, but in spirit. It reminded the eater that spring always comes again, that the earth, even in its tiredness, could sing. Sweet Sicily, the woodland whisper of sugar before sugar. In the shaded edges of old meadows, where the woods leaned close and the soil held the memory of leaf and rain, a plant once grew that sweetened the lives of those who knew its name. Before sugar was a common thing, before it was shipped in sacks across oceans or dusted over breakfast bread, there was Sweet Sicily. You would hardly notice it at first. Its leaves, delicate and fern-like, didn't cry out for attention. Its flowers, small white umbels, like tiny umbrellas, were as humble as lace left to dry on a stone wall. But press a leaf between your fingers, and you'd catch the secret. A soft scent, anise, fennel, something almost like licorice, rises to greet you. A sweetness that speaks not of candy or cakes, but of something simpler. Kinder, Sweet Sicily, or Myrrhis odorata, grew wild on the edges of hedgerows, especially in the cooler parts of northern Europe. It was a plant for the people, one that required no coaxing. It grew where others wouldn't. It thrived in dappled light and cold soil, and it gave something precious, a natural sweetness at a time when sugar was a luxury afforded only by nobles, monks and merchants. To understand Sweet Sicily's place in medieval life, we have to walk into the kitchen, not the great halls with their feasts and silver platters, but the small hearths of country homes where meals were made from whatever could be found, foraged or bartered. There, a young girl might bring in a bundle of Sweet Sicily to her mother, who would chop the leaves finely into a pot of bitter greens or stew them into milk, not just for flavor, but for balance, for sweetness without waste, for medicine in the form of comfort. Because Sweet Sicily was not just a kitchen herb, it was also a healer. In herbals copied lovingly by monks and passed between abbeys and midwives, Sweet Sicily appears often. Its roots were steeped in wine to calm the stomach, its seeds chewed to ease coughing, its leaves brewed as a tonic for the weary. One 13th century remedy describes combining its dried root with elderflower and honey to make a syrup for winter coughs. Another, from a French cottage book of the 1400s, recommends boiling its leaves into a milk drink for mothers who had trouble sleeping. And what of its seeds? Long and curved like miniature boat hulls, they were treasured. Sucked like sweets, chewed like breath fresheners, carried in small cloth pouches for long walks or fasting days. They were said to settle the digestion, freshen the breath, and sweeten the mood. Even the smell of the crushed seed was thought to bring clarity and calm. In places where winters were long and spring came slowly, Sweet Sicily was often among the first green things to push up from the thawed soil. Its early arrival made it precious. Children were sent to gather its young leaves along the hedgerows. Women brought in bunches to hang in kitchens or dry above the hearth. In some villages, it was stirred into the first soft cheese of the season, lending a hint of sugar and spring. And always, there was reverence, not the kind reserved for priests or nobles, but the quiet respect that country people had for anything that helped the body endure. In England and Scotland, where Sweet Sicily found its favourite climate, it gained nicknames: sweet fern, garden myrrh, and even sugar leaf. In some older dialects, it was simply called honeywort, and in every name, the same truth: here was a plant that offered sweetness, not in price or in pounds, but in presence. But with the rise of sugar, refined, packed and shipped, Sweet Sicily began to fade. By the 1700s, it was being replaced in the kitchens of the rich by cane sugar from the colonies. The folk recipes that had called for its root or seed were rewritten with tablespoons of molasses or lumps of white sugar. Slowly, the plant slipped from medicine, then from meals, and finally from memory. In some forgotten corners of Britain, though, it lingered. In the high dales and shaded moors, where soil stayed cold, and life moved at the pace of sheep and rain. There, it grew still, unplanted, but not unwelcome. Occasionally, an elder would bend to pick a sprig, sniff it thoughtfully, and smile. Still sweet, they might say. Today Sweet Sicily is returning, not in supermarkets, but in gardens where old things are loved. Heirloom gardeners treasure it. Herbalists grow it alongside their chamomile and comfrey. And those who taste its leaf for the first time are often struck by how sweet nature can be, without needing to be loud about it. If you ever find yourself walking an old trail in spring, where the woods edge into meadow, and the moss grows thick between stones, look for the gentle green fronds of Sweet Sicily. Press a leaf between your fingers, breathe it in, let it whisper its story, not of wealth or power, but of sweetness that asks nothing in return. And in that quiet moment, remember, before sugar, there was sweetness. Before medicine was bought, it was gathered, and before the world rushed, it walked. Hedge mustard, the quiet heat, beside the path. It never sat proudly in the center of a medieval garden. It wasn't laid out in orderly beds or written into the royal herbals with elegant flourishes. Hedge mustard grew where the rules ran out, along the edges of footpaths between fence posts and in the trampled corners where livestock had passed. It belonged to the margins, and that's where its quiet fire took root. The plant looked plain at first glance: slender stems, narrow leaves, small yellow flowers that could easily be mistaken for nothing at all. But the people of the countryside knew better. If you pinched a leaf between your fingers and brought it to your lips, the taste would bloom fast and sharp, peppery, grassy, with a bite that lingered at the back of the throat. Not as fiery as horseradish, not as pungent as garlic, but alive all the same. The kind of flavor that reminded you that even the smallest plants could carry great strength. In the early morning hours, while mist still clung to the hedgerows and the smoke from breakfast fires was only just beginning to rise, hedge mustard could be found damp with dew, its stems bowed with the weight of it. Herbalists walked the footpaths with low baskets, clipping the upper shoots with bone-handled scissors. It was said that the plant lost its healing edge after noon, when the sun was too high and the sap too sluggish. Timing mattered, and hedge mustard had many uses. The old medical texts called it the singer's friend. In an age when voices carried sermons, songs and shouted warnings over fields and walls, a hoarse throat was no small matter. Leaves of hedge mustard, boiled into thin broths or mixed with honeyed vinegar, were steeped and sipped by monks, criers, and even travelling minstrels. It soothed, it strengthened. Some believed it protected the voice from curses, though that was not written down, only whispered. Cooks didn't love it. The flavor was too wild, too unpredictable. But in lean seasons it was gathered anyway, chopped fine into stews, or pressed into soft cheese, or ground with salt and oil into a sharp green paste. In Normandy, women stirred it into cold milk to make a healing tonic. In the Highlands, shepherds chewed it raw to stay alert on long walks. And in the low valleys of Saxony, children used the stalks as pretend arrows, because when dried, they were light and straight and quick to fly. But perhaps its most enduring legacy was that it never needed asking. Hedge mustard came back every year, without tending. It grew not in the rich rows of cultivated land, but at the feet of travellers, where boots had pressed the earth firm. It was a plant of the in-between, between towns, between seasons, between hunger and fullness. In one tale passed down from the Welsh borderlands, an old woman was said to have survived a bitter winter on hedge mustard, and little else. Each day she gathered just enough from the track behind her cottage to boil into broth. When asked why she never picked more, she only said, "The path gives what I need, no more." By the 17th century, hedge mustard had fallen out of favour. Formal gardens preferred order and beauty, not the scruffy resilience of roadside weeds. But in the pages of the oldest herbals, dog-eared, foxed with damp, and annotated in cramped Latin, its name still appears. Cicimbrium officinale, the plant that lived where others didn't, the sharp green line along the edge of every worn trail. Today it still grows, though few remember its story, still sprouting in alleys, along chain-link fences, and between the cracks of urban pavements. The world has changed, but hedge mustard hasn't. It waits quietly for the footstep and the eye willing to notice. Because not all medicine grows in gardens, some waits beside the path. Woad leaves, the blue-green secret of the dye-maker's garden. In the earliest hours of morning, when mist clung low across the fallow ridges, and a hush lingered over the thatched hamlets of medieval Europe, there grew a plant with a secret. At first glance, woad was unassuming, broad green leaves rising from a sturdy rosette, its flowers yellow and cheerful in spring. But for those who knew how to coax its colours from the leaf, it held something precious. Blue, not the blue of a painted wall, nor the bright blue of a king's robe, but a deeper, earthier hue, the kind of blue that looked as though it had come not from paint, but from the soil itself. In a world of wool and linen, this blue made the plain magnificent. Long before modern dyes and synthetic colours, Woad Ascites tinctoria was the primary source of blue pigment across much of medieval Europe. Farmers in France, England, and the Low Countries cultivated it in dedicated plots, not for food, but for transformation. And while it was not eaten often by humans, woad belonged deeply to the world of medieval labour, survival, and identity. Harvesting woad was no gentle pastime. The leaves were gathered by hand, crushed and shaped into balls, then left to ferment in tightly packed heaps for weeks. The process was pungent, labour-intensive, and alchemical. Those who worked the woad vats were considered a breed apart, their hands stained, their noses accustomed to the strong, sour scent of the dyeing pits. But they held the power to turn white wool into a sky-coloured tapestry, or a farmer's tunic into a knightly garment. In the countryside of England, Entire communities were once built around woad production. The dye trade boomed, feeding the needs of weavers, tailors, and merchants. In some monastic records, woad leaves are listed alongside garden vegetables and medicinal herbs, a testament to their importance, not just for trade, but for the symbolic richness they added to monastic robes and liturgical cloth. And it wasn't just the wealthy who prized the color. Folk garments often bore a faint bluish hue, dyed in weaker infusions, showing that even the poorest laborer might, at times, wear something touched by woad. It was said that blue protected the soul from harm, and so a swaddled infant or a funeral shroud might carry traces of it, just enough to ward off ill spirits. Though rarely eaten, the leaves were not without value in the kitchen or the apothecary. Some healers steeped them in warm water to soothe inflamed skin, while others dried and powdered the leaves to mix into poultices. The bitter taste, though, kept them far from most stew pots. Eventually, with the rise of indigo and synthetic dyes, woad faded. Fields once blue with its harvest went fallow, but it has never vanished. In heritage dye gardens and among traditional weavers, woad still makes its quiet return. It remains a plant of quiet mystery. It asks more work than most, and gives back not food, but transformation. It turned colorless cloth into royal splendor. It turned leaf into legend. And for those who still walk old footpaths and stoop over old soil, its presence whispers of a time when color itself was precious, and blue, above all, was a gift of the earth.